Hello, and thank you for joining us. And you can't laugh right as soon as I start talking, Cody.
I'm sorry.
You should just leave this entire thing in.
I will. Don't worry.
Hello, and thank you for joining us in Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to a highly fixated view of large, dense books, in particular, the works in context of Thomas Pynchon. Guests here.
My name is Cody.
I'm Luke.
And I'm Will.
And after a bit of a break from us, we are returning with, what is this, season 5? We've done 4 books, right? Yeah, that's crazy.
Yes.
Season 5 of Mapping the Zone is going to be covering Against the Day, and will be running longer than this podcast has existed to this point. Breaking up this book into I guess, easily digestible sections is the we'll be covering this book until about January of 2026 if everything stays on track. So this is by far going to be the longest of not only our podcast seasons, but of Pynchon's books. We have a guess that that's probably why there's so little sort of critical materials or analysis on this book, is just literally the amount of time that it would take to do that. I mean, when we interviewed Brett for the podcast a couple of different times, he talked about just how long it took him to write a companion for 700 pages of Pynchon. I can't imagine what he would be looking at if he added another 300 on top of that already sort of tall order. So all that is to say is, bear with us as we continue through this process, and hopefully, if you're a Pynchon reader who either has maybe found this book difficult to get through because of how long it is, that you'll find a resource in our podcast and sort of breaking it up and having these sort of regular discussions on the material. Or if you're simply someone who loves this book and just is sort of thirsting for more material on it, that we will be able to provide some sort of additional enjoyment to a book you already enjoy. But to start, before we even get into chapters 1 through 3, we're going to be going over pages 1 through 25. Now, as a moment of clarity, the pagination that all 4 of us are going to be using is related to the Penguin paperback edition of the book. As far as any of us are aware, that is the primary paperback that is available in America. However, that being said, there is a European paperback that likely has a different pagination. So if you are going along with us, we will give not only just the page number, but also what the last line of the sections we're going through is, so that way you will have more than enough opportunity to sort of locate where those different breakpoints are. And now, I want to turn it over to the rest of the panel here to ask sort of what your experience with this book is, your impression of the book. My answer to this is really easy. It's the only one I've not read. So I'm excited for it, but beyond that, I really got nothing else to say. So Cody, Luke, Will, what is your past experience with the book? What do you think about the book? Et cetera, et cetera.
I don't think it's a secret to anyone who has listened to the show for more than one episode that this is my favorite of his work. It is one of my favorite books in general. I'm, as I routinely tell my son, I'm at a point in my life now where I have trouble like ranking things like media that I enjoy and trying to put it into some sort of like a finite top 5 or top 10 or anything like that. So I try to avoid doing that, but I do consider this among my just favorite books in general. And knowing that this was probably a question that was going to come up at the beginning of this episode, I've been kind of thinking about like what it is specifically that I really like about this book, because when you, like you said earlier, Kate, like this is a huge undertaking, even for Pynchon. Like this is his longest book. It's 1,085 pages, I think, something like that. And it is as dense as anything else he has written. It is really, I think, a culmination of all of his strengths as a writer. And it is a melding of different genre sandboxes that works way better than it has any right to, just because of the general kind of natural disparity that exists between the types of genres that he's playing with. But his talent as a writer and to be able to uh, pay homage to those genres and write in those styles and blend them into each other as the story moves along is brilliant. The characters are among the best that he has done. They are fully fleshed out. They are very well realized. They're the main arcs that we follow throughout are just absolutely incredible. Stylistically, I mean, it's Pynchon, so you know you're in for really wonderful prose and beautiful, scene setting and dialogue and everything else that he has going for him. I think also in general, I just really like big books. I've always kind of gravitated towards really large, challenging books, and I think the reason for that is I just find I have more time to live in that world, and especially with a book like this, it's a world that I really want to keep going back to and characters that I want to keep engaging with. Lou Basnight, who we don't meet in this particular section, but we will meet in the next section, is maybe my favorite Pynchon character of all time. So, and the Chums of Chance, I mean, I love everything with them. I know a lot of people are kind of either hot or cold on them. I love their storylines throughout here. I love the scenes with all the Western stuff with the write outs and the vibes and everything. So there is everything in this book that I just love about literature, and it is just all crammed into this beautifully thick book that I absolutely adore.
This is kind of like a comfort read for you, isn't it, Cody?
It really is. Like, this is the book that I have taken with me. I hate flying, and so this is like my safety book that makes me kind of not have panic attacks when I'm flying. And it's one I know a lot of people talk about, like, they'll just pick up Gravity's Rainbow and flip to sections and read through it. And I do that from time to time too. But Against the Day is, if I'm in a reading slump or just bored and want to read something, I find myself picking this one up and I'll just flip to a random chapter and just kind of read for a little while. And it's a very much of a comfort book for me.
How many times have you read it?
Front to back, this will be my fourth.
Oh, dang. Okay.
Yeah, so for me, I first read this book about 10, 11 years ago. Whenever I was during my first year out of college, I was substitute teaching, and I would read this book while I was subbing or working at my other job. I had taken, I think, 3 different classes in college related, either directly about the Gilded Age, or kind of either were about the Gilded Age or they covered that time period at least partially. So I had a lot of good background information for it whenever I did my first read of it. And it was probably, I think I liked it more than Gravity's Rainbow or anything else I mentioned the first time I read it. I think partially because of the amount of background information I had going into it, where I did know a lot about World War II before going to Gravity's Rainbow, but it wasn't quite the same kind of reading experience. Now, I mean, I would probably put Against the Day as my second favorite Pynchon after Gravity's Rainbow. I'm rereading Gravity's Rainbow right now, like very, very slowly, just like a couple chapters a week, and it's probably regained its place atop my Pynchon pantheon. Yeah, there's a lot to love about this book. The parts of it are set in Colorado Springs, where I went to high school. So that's always, I always love those parts. I miss the mountains in Colorado, and there's a good amount of this book that's set in the mountains of Colorado. And yeah, there's just a lot of different stuff in this book that I really like. I mean, the opening with the World's Fair is really cool. All the stuff with the Chums of Chance is really fun. I really love all the digressions about the fictional, I guess, non-existent, except for in the world of this book, digressions about the different Chums of Chance books. Also about anarchists in the late 1800s is really cool, which we do get a little bit of that in the opening section. Yeah, it's just a really fun book. I do kind of, I maybe want to push back a little bit with Cody in terms of, I do think that on a sentence by sentence basis, this isn't as dense as maybe Mason and Dixon and Gravity's Rainbow. I do think that the concepts it plays with and the scope of it maybe make it rival those books in density some, but I do think it's easier to read than those books, I would say, than those other 2 long novels, which is a plus for me. That being said, there's so many characters, and some of the characters will be, they'll be mentioned for a chapter or 2 or a page or 2, and then they'll come up, like 500 pages later and be very important characters and stuff, which does, make the book a little bit more difficult to read at times. so I don't want to push back on Cody too much, but I do think it is easier to read than some of his other stuff. Yeah, I do really like this book a lot. I'm really looking forward to rereading it. I tried to reread it alongside the Pynchon Reading Group with the subreddit a few years ago, and I don't remember exactly what happened, but I just got kind of bogged down and kind of lost my place with the reading group and didn't end up finishing it. So I've read it about 1.5 times before.
I will say I was struck by the easy sort of readability of the first 25 pages as well, Luke. Like being a complete newcomer to it, I was very surprised at how it feels weird saying that, but like how readable it is, especially compared to a lot of his other works. Yeah.
It's absolutely right. I mean, and I think that's a sign of his growth and strength as a writer at that point in his career, is that he was able to take the density of something like Gravity's Rainbow and make it more, I mean, for lack of a better term, yeah, readable and just kind of, not as technically not as technically dense, but still dense, but more. And I think part of it also has to do with the fact that, especially in this opening section and all the other sections, he's very much writing it in that style. And those books were very breezy and just kind of light reading, so to speak. And so it carries that tone with it throughout. And you'll see, as we go through and switch into the different genres, that tone and that writing style switch up as well. And again, that I think speaks a lot to his skill as a writer.
Yeah, I have to thank you, Luke, for being the one to push back on Cody there, because I'm tired of doing it, and I was gonna just let it slide this time. But I've read the book front to back once before, and I've read sections many times, and I read about the first half of it in this break between our seasons here. And what I find so interesting about this book is that it is not. I don't. Again, I agree with Luke if we're gonna set up a dichotomy here. Um, in that I think that on a word by word level, this book Against the Day is less dense than, say, Gravity's Rainbow. I'm not sure I agree that it's less dense than Mason and Dixon, but that doesn't matter. But the way I would describe it is in the way that Gravity's Rainbow is playing with form on the scale of neologism and forcing narrative into paradigms that are not conducive to narrative. Scientific paradigms, mathematical paradigms, religious ones, mythical ones that are not really narrative in structure. On a deep letter by letter, sentence by sentence level, this book, it's blown out to the extent that it's for me, it's like reading it has that same degree of being able to retokenize and restructure the entire context of the chapter or section around a single word, if you flip the interpretation, as something like Gravity's Rainbow, but without that being the primary mode of discourse with the reader. It is that the way that he plays with genre throughout the book that gives it so much surface level levity and ease, while maintaining that incredible intertextuality and thematic density that the Pynchon is known for. And I just this is the book out of Pynchon's novels that I truly feel that I understand the least of in some, because it's just so big and it's just so not even in page count, but in terms of scope, in terms of what is being discussed, is so discursive and so wide reaching that, like, I'll just sit there and get reading through the first chapter, not even the all 25 pages that we're going to be discussing today, but just the first 7 or so. I'll just get stuck thinking about, like, okay, well, what does this have to do with topography? where are the vectors and the quaternions coming from?
Mhm.
And it's, it's not in your face, but it's there, and if you're looking for it, it'll come to you. And it's to me, it's like an experience of snow blindness, where there's just so much information to be gleaned, and there's so much space in the information that your brain thinks that it understands what's going on, and what it thinks is going on is just blank. At least my brain does that, even though there's so much detail to be appreciated on every page, in every sentence. And that's just an incredible thing. I wouldn't say necessarily it's my favorite Pynchon novel, and I wouldn't say I like it. I like its approach to formal experimentation more than Gravity's Rainbow, but it's a really enjoyable book on every level for me, even if it is extremely fatiguing on a very basic level.
Even just holding the book up is physically demanding.
That's why the paperback's a lot easier to read than the hardback.
Yeah,
The first time I read it was with the hardback, and I'd have to have it like in my lap just to be able to read it for an extended period of time.
yeah, you were saying that you take it on flights, and
Yep.
I think I've made the joke before off air, but I'm sure it makes you feel safe because it provides a source of gravity.
It can be used as a pillow. It can be used as a flotation device if need be. It's wide ranging functionality.
You could probably use it to like smack a hijacker unconscious.
Yeah. There you go.
It's a multifaceted piece of material.
It's the Leatherman tool of books.
Yeah. I feel like we should add that pull quote to a new edition of the book. So that brings us to general thoughts on the first 3 chapters. What did we think of pages 1 through 25?
I remember still the first time I read this book, and I think it might have been around the same time Luke did, about 10, 11 years ago. I picked it up at the library just because I'd finished reading Inherent Vice and really liked it, and wanted to go for something else of his, and this was the only other one they had at that particular library. And I remember specifically like starting this and thinking like, this is kind of weird. Like it's that boys' adventures kind of novel feel, and
Yeah.
I haven't read anything like that since I was a kid. But because of that, like instantly kind of connected with that younger part of me that really enjoyed some of those novels. I didn't read a whole lot of them, but fantasy reads kind of the same way as those boys' novels kind of things do at times. And so it immediately kind of, I think, sets this really interesting tone, and the chums themselves, like as we kind of go through and meet each one of them and get to know their very unique and very distinct personalities. I think these chapters do some a really good job of introducing the chums at this point. These are really the only characters that we're going to get to know, and kind of getting a sense of their adventures and their attitudes and their behavior with each other. But then at the same time, we're also getting these mysterious little glimpses. Like, at one point, it's kind of implied based on a line that mentions them working with the Mexican president at the time. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. It's in the notes somewhere, but essentially that because they were working with like the Interior Department for him, there's this like level of, are they working with like secret police and doing stuff that's kind of behind the scenes, like shitty police work and union breaking and stuff like that. We don't really know the full extent of everything they're doing, but they are presented as these real people, but they're also characters that exist in novels that exist within this world. And so it's like this really interesting way of presenting these characters where you're already jumping into this metafiction idea of, characters within characters or stories within stories. And you have, fourth wall break that comes within the first few pages. You've got what might be the fastest time to a song in a Pynchon novel, I think, of all. It's like 15 pages in, we get a song.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, it's a really fun opening set of chapters that I think really is. I think starting with the chums is the absolute right way to go with this story. I think it really puts the reader into that world and the sort of fantastical elements that are going to exist and come into play later, and kind of settling the reader into this, as with most of his work, that there's always this sort of mystical realism that exists or magical realism that exists throughout his work. And I think using the chums to kind of set the table for that is a really smart move, and one that really kind of helps the reader very easily slip into this world and kind of get acclimated to, how the rest of this story is going to fold out.
Had you already discovered the Venture Brothers at the time that you
Oh yes,
read this
yeah.
book? Because that would be something else that certainly is an analog as far as the like a source material that it is sort of riffing
Yeah.
off of. Yeah.
That's definitely. I have to imagine Pinchon is a fan of that show, because that show is so smartly written and would seems like it would just be right up his alley.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
for anyone who's listening who has not watched that show, I highly encourage you to go watch it. It might be my favorite animated show. Might even just be one of my favorite shows in general. It is absolutely hilarious, and yeah, it's playing with the same kind of thing of the boy adventurer, and like, but what happens when the boy adventurer grows up and is just a burnout and can't really do anything right. But no, yeah, this I love the Chums of Chance, and I love starting the story with them, and I think it helps with the immersion of kind of diving into this world.
Yeah, I would agree. But it also does help with the secrecy behind like who, for lack of a better term, like runs the Chums of Chance. Like
Mhm.
who's the one that like gives them their orders, who's the one that like organizes this kind of group of airships that are staffed by multiple people. And kind of the way that Pynchon begins this book in these first 25 pages with a, like, for lack of a better term, like a really close lens on this group of people on this airship, and then kind of like very slowly pulls the camera out to the point where you discover that, like, oh, like they have a boss, or they have
Like
like an
like an HQ
organization they
kind of thing,
report to,
yeah.
a headquarters, right? And then, oh, they have like a command staff structure. And like, oh, there are other ships also within the same sort of like organization that have different crews than this. And then like, oh, there are different organizations that all exist in this version of the United States that run airships and have their own sort of command staff programs. And like it is an interesting way to like slowly reveal that, and a very clever way to like slowly reveal that. So I would agree that from an outside perspective of not being familiar with the world that this book is operating in, it is a very clever and a very engaging way to like very slowly fill the reader in a way that doesn't feel contrived or like Pynchon is talking directly to the audience. And starting with sort of the buffoonery, I'll say, of the main characters, in all of them being kind of weird, it is an enjoyable way to kind of clip your readers along. And like I had already said, like, I found these 25 pages to be probably the most easily readable of anything we've covered so far, from a perspective of just like consistently not only being able to picture what Pynchon is describing in my own mind, but also from a perspective of just sort of the meanings behind the sort of deeper analysis that he's doing, and the dialogue and what everything's being talked about. It's all very, very easily digestible in a way that is not only, I think, the sort of growth of an author, so to speak, to your point, Cody, but is also probably a necessity for a book this long. Because if you're going to ask your reader to sign up to read 1,000 pages, doing so with the density of Gravity's Rainbow is going to want to make someone jump off a building.
Mhm.
Like that's too much over the course of that kind of a runtime. So I think he also smartly understands that like this is important for a book of this length, but also aping the kind of stuff that he's aping, like the Hardy Boys or those other kind of, young boy adventure novels that existed in the Gilded Age and right afterwards. Tom Swift and all of that stuff. Those are very easily digestible middle grade novels. Like they were read by adults, but that isn't necessarily their target audience.
Yeah.
And so Pynchon deciding to kind of take, he's not writing a James Patterson novel from a perspective of its ease of digestion, but from a perspective of the rest of his canon of literature. I think it's very smart. And this deals with an era of history that I really enjoy, and a style of writing that I really enjoy. The easiest analog that I can probably think of to describe the world that this book exists in is Bioshock Infinite, as far as how things probably look and sort of the time frame and all of that, especially with the sort of steampunk elements that exist there. So getting a chance to like be introduced to that world, but then also to have, again, like he does in all of his books, the real life history of the World's Fair and the kind of rising tide of anarchism with the expansion of capitalism and commerce is great. And then, the references to the Pinkertons and the striking for an 8-hour workday and the riots in Chicago and everything. It's all really, really excellent stuff. And it makes me very excited about sort of where it's going to go.
Yeah, I do think that opening with the Chums of Chance is probably a really good idea. Is like from the perspective of the rest of the book, a pretty masterful move by Pynchon. Where I don't want to do any spoilers, but some of the other characters and families and groups of characters are a little bit more. I don't want to say difficult, but just not as purely likable as the Chums of
They're much
Chance.
darker. They're a lot darker, I think, and that's
Yeah,
probably
it's a good way to put it.
make it a lot harder to open with that.
Yeah, and I also really love the opening. That the opening deals with the World's Fair. If you're listening to this and you're not super familiar with the World's Fair, there's a very in-depth Wikipedia article about it. But it was kind of a formative thing for America. It kind of put America on the map in some ways, put Chicago on the map as an international city.
It was a big deal just in general, those World's Fairs
Yeah.
they do every year.
That is true. Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, it was a time period where World's Fairs were. I don't think we do World's Fairs anymore, but it was a time
No,
period where World's
sadly.
Fairs were a massive deal. Yeah, just kind of maybe skip ahead a little bit. The depiction of the World's Fair, it's probably one of my favorite parts of this book, and the people being swallowed whole by anacondas and just all that stuff is just really fun and really well written. And yeah, as I already kind of went over a little bit, like the different digressions about the different Chums of Chance books, I really love. And I just love how lighthearted the beginning is. It's just very kind of joyful, especially, even the first few lines are just very joyful. There's a lot of exclamation marks. Everyone's enthusiastic.
Yeah, and I would like to thank Kate in particular, but all of you for helping me demonstrate exactly what I referred to as the snow blindness of reading this book. Because to me, this is not a light, breezy opening into the world. This reads very specifically as the author saying, "This is a contrivance. All of this is a contrivance," and it in a very compelling and enjoyable way. But I have a very hard time personally taking the Chums of Chance seriously as characters at this point. And that does change as the book goes on. But at this point in time, especially in these first two chapters, it's not that they seem like you know puppets for the author or as speakers for various ideologies, but more that just the sum total of these opening chapters with regards to the characters of these crew members. They feel so stretched out. They feel so thin, not necessarily in terms of characterization, but in what they're doing, I guess. And by the time you get to the middle of this section, with the little bit about Darby working on the valve, it feels like one of those kind of intrinsic aspects of the form of this novel that you would start with the Chums of Chance. Like, it doesn't seem like that's an option. It seems like if you're going to have this book with these characters who fly in and out of the world or on and off of the ground, and it feels inevitable that you'd have to start with them in order to say this is a contrivance, or else by the time you introduce these aeronauts, by the time you introduce this perpetual motion machine, it doesn't seem believable. So you have to start out with saying this is the contrived part, and I think that's delightful.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, and the way that segues into the harsh realities of the world, the non-fictional aspects of the World's Fair in this book, it feels so exciting.
It does. He captures what the excitement of probably going to something like that was. I would say.
Yeah, I mean that's. I mean, at the time when World's Fairs were a thing, it was always the the showcase for the newest and the greatest and the most mysterious technologies that were available. And so yeah, there was a certain magic about being there. And of course, we look back at it now and it's things that wouldn't impress anybody today, but at the time, this is when electricity was like brand new, and
Yeah.
and so for a lot of people, seeing this kind of stuff happen was, that's why people cry Satanism and stuff, because it looked like witchcraft. There was so many people didn't have a fundamental understanding of how these things worked. Not that a lot of people now understand how a lot of the technology we use works, but it was showcased in that kind of way too, of like this, like, look how otherworldly this is, look how alien this technology is, and the applications that they're going to throw out there that are going to happen, but they never will. That's just their selling points. But yeah, it's a very much a sensory overload, I think, would be probably the best way to describe it when you're going into something like that.
And that is important context for the reader too, is that as far as the 1893 World's Fair is concerned in particular, that is really where like the war between alternating current and direct current was put on display. Like as far as like, yes, as it says in the book, it was considered like the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus, quote unquote, founding America. But really, as far as what was being put on display and what was being sort of showcased, it was electricity. And the kind of genius of alternating current and the sort of inherent sort of expansion of technology in general that was going to bring about. So when they talk about kind of the electric glow of the White City and stuff like that, that is more or less a direct reference to the main thing that was being showcased that year as far as an important discovery or invention. Do we have any other general thoughts before we move into specifically what happens?
I'll just say that with the Thelonious Monk epigraph that we have here,
I was going to ask people's interpretation of that.
his music makes for very good reading. If anyone listening is like me and has to have music on while you read, Monk is a very good choice for this book.
So yeah, that also fits given the theory that all the Chums of Chance are named after different jazz artists.
Mm-hmm.
Which do you have sort of to hand a list of those characters and who they map to, Cody?
I don't. I meant to write down because I remembered that. Obviously, I think Miles Blundell is pretty on the nose.
Yeah, Miles Davis. Chick is Chick Corea.
Chick Corea, yeah.
The other ones I don't remember off the top of my head.
I found it on the wiki.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, Darby Hicks, Boots Randolph, and Vachel Lindsay, which they note is maybe a stretch.
Yeah, so there's some possible inspiration there, and the wiki does bring up the fact that Pynchon is a avowed jazz enthusiast, particularly one for Thelonious Monk. But that brings up the question. The book does begin with this epigraph from Thelonious Monk. Do you just want to read it real quick, Cody? I'd imagine you have it right in front of you.
Yeah, it's always night, or we wouldn't need light.
What the wiki goes in depth about sort of the fact that Thelonious Monk may have been known for saying this phrase or a variation of this phrase, but do we have any interpretations as far as why it's included here at the beginning of the book?
I mean, the only thing I can think is, and I say this without wanting to get too far into what the book is going to deal with later, but the idea of duality comes into play very heavily throughout this book, and I feel like that is kind of what that's getting at, especially when we get into the Iceland Spar section. This sort of dynamic between two opposites and how they interact and how they are parallel to each other is a very, very big part of everything. And I think, for me at least, that's kind of what that's gearing towards.
Which would make sense with the inclusion of the Tibetan Chamber of Commerce seal on the next page.
Yeah.
But did anyone else have any interpretations they wanted to put forth on the quote?
Well, I'll get into the more broader interpretations later in the book. I think same as Cody. What I'd like to highlight, I guess, at this moment is that the quote sets up not just the contrast, not just the dichotomy between night and light, or day and night, or dark and light, but also the fact that the phrase itself is it situates the state of the world and then the desire of us as the people hearing the quote and the person speaking the quote. And between that intersection of dualities, I see a lot of the inspiration of this book stemming from that, with the manifolds of reality in the form of aether, and the manifolds of thought in the form of, abstract geometry and fictional reality discourse as the novel goes on.
Yeah, I do think that there's an element of opposite, or there's a big element, obviously, of opposites and duality in this book, and I do think that that quote is playing with that, in a more kind of direct and obvious way. I do think it could be, like we were just talking about, a kind of commentary on the importance of electricity during this time period, in terms of, before electricity was invented, we had to use fire to, combat the darkness at night, and then, we suddenly had this light bulbs and electricity and, artificial light, and I do think that that quote is kind of playing with that, and with the consequences of artificial, basically like artificial sunlight, although it's not exactly the same. And to get into I do think there's an element of this book, more than most other Pynchon novels. I think even more than maybe even like Gravity's Rainbow, has a lot to do with like good versus evil, and the shades of gray between those two dichotomies, those two opposites, where there are, there's a lot of characters in this book that, seem evil but do good things, or they seem good but they do evil things. Even the Chums of Chance in this first section, which I think Cody already kind of alluded to this. It's not really clear which side of the law they're on. There is a mention of other aeronautics clubs that seem to be a little bit more on the side of, liberty and justice, and the Chums of Chance perhaps are. I think it's like the group of like Paris of 71 or something, who seem to be kind of more classic underdog versus, overlord type people than the Chums of Chance. But yeah, I do think there's an element of good versus evil in the epigraph as well.
Yeah, I would certainly agree, and I think that, like, looking at the time frame that the book takes place in, I think a lot of it sort of sets the stage for the dawn of kind of the struggle of good versus evil as Pynchon sees it in the modern world in particular. This kind of struggle between anarchism and commerce, or capitalism and sort of ludditism, and sort of the shades of gray that exist within those in particular, and the way that the sort of force counterforce, as he analyzes over most of his career, starts to kind of change and adjust with the dawn of something like electricity, and the kind of introduction of what that means for an expansion of modernity. We move from there to a cover seal that there's a very interesting story regarding someone seeking out like the Tibetan Cultural Society or something like that to get it translated. You can read about this person's quest in the Pynchon wiki, but essentially this cultural organization that the individual reached out to basically said that the easiest way to sort of translate what the seal itself says is that it would say something like Tibetan like Chamber of Commerce, basically. And sort of expanding on that idea of duality, it's pretty easy to point to the idea that Pynchon is taking something that is sort of considered a spiritual hub or a spiritual center in the world. A lot of people associate sort of Tibet with Eastern wisdom and Eastern spirituality and meditation and sort of like enlightenment and paradise. But then even in that place, they still have commerce. It's like dark evil that Pynchon has examined over several books of commerce and capitalism and sort of the modern world that's driven by it still exists in a place that is renowned for its sort of spirituality. So pointing to this again, this idea of duality and good and evil and how these things sort of exist within one another, seems to make a lot of sense, and I think opens up the book in a pretty perfect way for what I understand he'll be spending 1,000 pages talking about.
Yeah.
So that does bring us to part one, called The Light Over the Ranges. And we start with a introduction to the celebrated aeronautics club known as the Chums of Chance. In case you're unaware, Chums of Chance is a quote derived from Finnegan's Wake. And the Chums of Chance, our heroes, are starting to sort of prep their hydrogen skyship named the Inconvenience. Pynchon will never not be hilarious when it comes to naming boats. or ships of any kind. He always picks something very funny, readying their vessel to go to Chicago to the World's Fair, as we've talked a couple of different times, or known then as the World's Columbian Exposition, which is going to be celebrating 400 years since Christopher Columbus's voyage towards the West Indies. The World's Fair at the time is pretty important for a couple of reasons we've already mentioned. Another important detail is America's first serial killer stalked the 1893 World's Fair, a gentleman by the name of H.H. Holmes. The book Devil in the White City is a good sort of resource for the 1893 World's Fair from a nonfiction perspective by Eric Larson. You'll see the World's Fair referenced a lot in these 25 pages as a white city. This is referred largely to the fact that the more or less town they built, they would like build a sort of town for these World's Fairs, was made mostly out of white stucco. So it literally was white, the buildings that they were going to. So that is where they are headed. They are headed there because there is going to be a gathering of different aeronautics clubs that are going to be in the area. And we are sort of introduced sort of one by one to each of these different members of the organization, as well as to the idea that like they have a master at arms and they have a code of conduct that they have to abide by. There's very interesting back and forth on like whether profanity is allowed and to what degree, profanity should be allowed. Yeah, any thoughts that anyone has on the characters as we're introduced to them, or any overall thoughts sort of on a quick scan of these first couple pages where we're introduced to the chums and the fact that they have organizational insignia and the different rules and everything like that?
I mean, I like I said earlier, I really like the way that the characters are introduced. It's done very much in that adventure story style of pretty much flat out telling you like, Randolph St. Cosmo is the ship's commander and he's this, and Darby Suckling is, he's with his tow-colored locks streaming in the wind, and it does a really good job of kind of very bluntly stating like this, this is this quote, for lack of a better term, this like this kind of tropey person in this kind of story. This is this tropey person in this kind of story. And it's very surface level descriptions of these characters, but I think it does a really good job of still telling you, specifically like these are the plugins for this kind of book that we're about to go through. And then also just flat out telling you, breaking the fourth wall at the end of the first page, where Darby, as my faithful readers will remember, was the baby of the crew. He does such a good job of capturing that style in describing everything that's going on here, and I absolutely love that.
So I guess that does bring up a good question. If anyone else has more to add to the introduction of the characters, please feel free to go ahead and do so. But what do we think about the narrator? That fourth wall break, as Cody mentions, this idea of it deliberately saying Darby, as my faithful readers will remember. We talked a lot about this within context of Mason and Dixon, how there's an understanding of sort of that layered story structure eventually kind of going out to Pynchon himself being kind of the stand-in for Cherry Coke. Do we have any particular thoughts on who the narrator is? And again, as someone who hasn't read the book before, this could be discussed later on, but what do we think he's working with as far as the purposeful style of immediately breaking the kind of narrative depiction there?
I see it more as an homage to literature of this time period than anything else. So these fourth wall breaks, I could be wrong about this, but they don't occur any time other than during the Chums of Chance sections, I believe. I could be wrong about that.
No, you're right. It's only during those sections.
So so I do think it's a comment. It's just kind of an homage, a way to kind of place the read, like even more than all the little details. It kind of places the reader in that time period in a very kind of immersive way.
That makes sense, and it's not the only thing that Pynchon is doing that's like that. Obviously, as there's the references to the other Chums of Chance books that in theory exist, but additionally, and this was something that I picked up on from the fact that I own a lot of old Sherlock Holmes editions from sort of the Gilded Age into the Great Depression, and a lot of the spelling that he decides to use, particularly with umlauts, maps to literature of the time. In a lot of cases, words that were spelled with two O's, like cooperation, they would put an umlaut over the second O, as far as kind of books and literature of the period. So if he is doing that would make sense, because it's not the only thing that he's doing that's like that.
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely like what you and Luke are talking about, where it's very much paying homage to this style, because you'll see at the end of chapter 3, when we start to shift over into the detective agency, when is it Randolph goes into God, my mind is blanking. White City Investigations. You can see the tone, or not the tone, but the genre style shift at that point, and it kind of turns from this adventure style into starting to get into the sort of hard boiled detective noir kind of style that's coming after that. And again, this is something that I really love about this book, is his ability to blend these genres into each other so seamlessly. And we talked about it with Mason and Dixon, his use of that of the 17th century language and way of stylizing words and capitalizing certain nouns and things like that. It just adds another layer of immersion into the story, and I think having that fourth wall break does exactly the same thing.
Makes sense. Any other thoughts on that before we move on to Pugnax?
It's a fairly natural evolution of the style that it takes center in Gravity's Rainbow, and then in a lot of the other books set in and around the time that Gravity's Rainbow was written, where the style and the verbiage and the way that things are perceived by the narrator are all being changed by who is the subject of the narration at the moment, and just taking that, not just, but to take that to the next level of saying, we are going to play with the genre signifiers. We're not just going to loosely move between these things, but this is an indicator of who these people are, how they think of themselves, why they act the way they do. And in a again, to step further into the book than just this very introduction, it to me is a corollary to the imaginary component of a complex number, is these little asides from a narrator who isn't talking to anyone, because we're reading the book and we don't get anything out of these asides other than maybe exposition and some jokes.
Yeah, that's true. So the members of the Inconvenience are not just human. There is also a dog. There is a dog named Pugnax in particular, which, if you're unfamiliar, that's Latin for basically fighting, or a propensity towards combat. This dog is similar to the learned English dog, is intelligent, and doesn't speak English, but does speak in a way that humans can interpret. And his first line is charmingly written as a bunch of like woofing sounds. Very much playing with like I'm sure that there is like an analog from the time frame, but the first thing that obviously comes to mind is Scooby-Doo. How he is able to make just dog noises, and they're able to understand what he's saying. You have a note in here, Cody, in our group notes, Pugnax as /the reader. Did you have something you wanted to talk about with that?
Yeah, that'll come up on the next page, though. So if you want to keep going.
Sure enough. So what Pugnax does do, as far as one of his jobs, is he reads all of the material that finds its way on board the ship. He seems to be acting as some kind of a censor in that perspective, reading any material that comes aboard, ostensibly for approval before it goes to anybody else. And we find him engaged in reading a book by Henry James called The Princess Casamassima. If I'm mispronouncing that, I apologize profusely. Which, it sounds great. I have not read any Henry James. He's always been on my list to get to. I'd love to read The Ambassadors someday. And like Turn of the Screw is a pretty big book of his. But this one, sort of given a brief description, it is the story of an intelligent but confused young London bookbinder Hyacinth Robinson, who becomes involved in radical politics and a terrorist assassination plot. And Pugnax talks about how it may be a book of anarchist propaganda or related to a spreading wave of anarchism in general.
And Pugnax, of course, is typically more a fan of stories with dogs, not as it's described, not the dime novels that seem to make their way aboard the ship.
Which is a great detail that he reads everything, but in particular, he'd really prefer stories that feature. I think it says like lightly sentimental stories of his own kind or something like that. So something that he would want to read, like Old Yeller or like because I feel like a lot of the lightly sentimental dog stories I can think of, especially from the time frame, the dog like dies at the end of it.
Yeah.
Well, when did Homeward Bound come out?
Oh, that's a good question.
93.
So a good 100 years
94, I think.
after.
60s movie. 1961 was the novel, apparently.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I thought of when I thought of a book about dogs, but even that's way late. So I really don't know.
Maybe there were just a lot more books about dogs back then.
Maybe he was really into Tintin. Didn't Tintin have a dog?
Yeah, Tintin did have a dog, and he had a lot of problematic views on the world too. So.
Oh no.
The dog?
No, Tintin. Well, I guess maybe the author is a better way of putting that.
Not the child that the author created.
Yeah, no, I think the author had some problematic worldviews. I think that's probably the safer way to say that.
In the spirit of Lindsay Noseworth, if that Tintin can get hired as a war correspondent, he's adult enough to have a measured understanding of global politics.
Yeah.
There may be some truth to that.
I did also like the line on here, placing upon the word book an emphasis whose level of contempt can be approached perhaps only by executive officers.
Oh yeah. That was another one of my favorite lines as well. Did that bring us to the thought that you had on the dog?
Yeah. So I don't know if this might just be me making more of something than there really is, but the line in here, there must be an explanation. There might be an explanation, though he was not sure he should insist upon one. Explanations did not, as far as he could tell, appear to be anything dogs either sought or were even entitled to. Especially dogs who spent as much time as Pugnax did appear in the sky, far above the inexhaustible complex of odors to be found on the surface of the planet below. I mean, in the context of the story, he's talking about Pugnax using his sense of smell to identify Lindsay. But if you, this was just a weird little thing that popped into my head. If you plug in the word reader for dogs, it kind of plays as, like readers aren't entitled to any sense of explanation or meaning. It's more there for them to decide what that is. Like the author doesn't owe them, or the creator of that art doesn't owe them an explanation about what it is that they were trying to get at. And then especially when dogs who spent as much time as Pugnax did up here, like, especially with like reading fantasy and stuff, you're kind of elevating yourself into this level of fantasy and escapism that tends to disconnect you from, an actual, sometimes grounded explanation of what that art is. And so that lends to that more subjective kind of nature of it. I don't know. That might just be me making more of something than it is, but that popped into my head.
It's an interesting idea, that's for sure. That brings us to kind of the first, I guess I'll say, like, steampunk-esque sort of sci-fi invention. We hear about this device called the Screw, which allows the ship to float aloft in the air, particularly as a sort of perpetual motion machine. This is just another case of, like, Pynchon just really likes like pulpy sci-fi stuff, and I think he relishes the opportunity to sort of come up with them himself in his novels that are from a different perspective viewed as highbrow, something where like you wouldn't expect stuff like this to show up. But I think that this is the kind of stuff that he really loves playing with. This, and of course, like detective tropes and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that we do get stuff like this in here, and then at the end of the chapter, someone goes into a detective's office and immediately encounters a sassy secretary.
Yep.
Like he you can tell that this is a book that he's probably having a lot of fun. And within this, we get a reference to the fact that at one point, the Chums of Chance worked with, but I don't want to butcher this pronunciation. President Diaz, I'll say, of Mexico. I don't know if anyone has a better
I think it's
opportunity to. Yeah,
Porfirio. I may be.
Yeah.
I should get my kids are sick. I'm not bringing them in here to teach me Spanish right now.
Yeah, it would be Porfirio Diaz.
this is the first kind of inkling that something with the Chums of Chance may not be quite right from a perspective of who they
Mhm.
serve. If in case you don't know who this guy is, he is somebody who served as the president of Mexico on 3 separate occasions. He died in 1915 and has been referred to as a de facto dictator, kind of in the same way that like Putin is referred to as a de facto dictator. Like technically he is elected, and there was time frames in which he did abdicate power because he lost an election, or in Putin's case, went from being prime minister to the president and then just back to being the prime minister, or vice versa. But he is known for having a secret police, the Interior Ministry, which is the organization that the Chums of Chance worked with. But he is also particularly known for putting technocrats in power. So he helped the nation of Mexico, like, kind of overcome a intense period of economic stagnation and bring about some prosperity to the country. This is, as far as like positives from his time in power, is something that you'll find when you read history about him. But in particular, he was very interested in scientists and sort of technologists and put a lot of them in power and sort of created like a circle of trust with these scientists that helped benefit a lot of foreign investors coming into the country, which then led to a large amount of land and property consolidation. And in a lot of cases, that land consolidation and property acquisition led to conflict with the working class in Mexico and led to a lot of civil unrest and violent revolts, and then eventually could have led to like a civil war. But instead of that, and this gets into again stuff that I'm assuming is going to be very important, given the other stuff in these chapters, led to a lot of working strikes. Like a lot of the peasant class in Mexico did work stoppages and refused to continue laboring as a result of this, and that was kind of the stuff that set the stage for his downfall. And so somewhere in all of that, the Chums of Chance were involved. But I think the bigger thing, right, is you're reading something that is supposed to be ostensibly, I don't want to say necessarily patriotic, but like kind of fun and light, but they're integrating themselves with these dark forces, so to speak. Once again, going back to the duality, it's already come up a couple of times. First couple of pages here, as but it is a very interesting sort of thing to just include there. There's a very long Wikipedia article on this particular president of Mexico. There's a lot of books written about the time he was president. Very interesting. Um, if anyone else has anything particular to add about his presidency, that was the most relevant stuff that I was able to find related to it.
No, I don't have anything to add about that, but I will say to piggyback on that mention of duality, and again, for anyone new to this book, this is going to come up a lot. You have that mention of him and the sort of ominous nature of what the Chums may have been involved with him, and then it jumps immediately to for details of their exploits. See the Chums of Chance in Old Mexico. So just like right back into the but remember, this is an adventure novel, and we're here to have a good time and have fun and do good good time fun adventures and stuff. So setting that kind of goofiness next to something like that is I think very intentional, a way of kind of breaking up that that sort of dark undertone that's right there.
Yeah, and that same section is prefaced with basically, saying, look, these good kids would never go down to a place where there's all this gambling and tomfoolery.
Mm-hmm.
They were just there on official business to help out good old Presidente Porfirio Diaz.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, and I can give a little bit more context that I'm not sure will help anyone understand this anymore, but it is insightful, I think, beyond the immediacy of the book. But Porfirio Diaz really sold himself as a technocrat. He's basically said, hey, I'm the guy who's going to make sure that we are going to be doing things the right way. We're going to be making laws in ways that are guided by rationality. I'm going to be giving opportunities to people who are the best at running agricultural businesses, the best at running different sectors of the economy, because clearly what we need is to be doing the best. And if anyone is interested in, and I say this only because I've known a lot of people, particularly people in the engineering world, who say, why do people conflate technocrats and fascists? If you look into the presidencies multiple, because he was deposed multiple times, of Porfirio Diaz, you will see why those things are conflated these days, even though they are not the same. That it's just that 20, 30 years before fascism as an idea came to be, the Diaz administration was doing a lot of the same things.
And if I'm not mistaken, his final deposing led to the Maduro regime after him, I think.
I think that's right.
I
Yeah.
think that I'm just gonna say the Mexican Civil War is.
That's also
I don't think you could say
fair.
anything in particular came after that. It was a beautiful thing, but not exactly easily defined.
I have a feeling that Pynchon would have some interesting thoughts on the history of Mexico in the late 1800s and early 1900s. We also get this interesting quote here about ascending to descend. We get kind of an aside about how going up is going north, and there's also sort of this interesting kind of portion of that where we get a vignette about a new recruit to the Chums of Chance, like digging through their gear looking for cold weather gear because it's gotten so cold in the atmosphere that they go to. And there's kind of this almost zen quality of like, I'll give you a coat now, but eventually you will learn to deal with the cold. You will eventually adjust. And then we have this aside about the idea that it's, so if you went up high enough, you'd be going down again. Or if you go up high enough, you find like a different world, one that's kind of separate from the one of the sort of ground below, so to speak. What are your all's thoughts on this particular quote and kind of this the stuff talked about in veiled speech here? It's an interesting sort of
It
right at
is,
the moment.
and this again will come back into play later in the story. The Pynchon wiki mentions that in a lot of Pynchon's books, the North is given a sort of coldness, or as they deem it, anti-life. So there's a couple of things that I was thinking of regarding that particular line. The idea of ascending to descend, that maybe in this case going north to a certain point where you hit this sort of zenith point and then begin to go back downward, is if we're looking at it in the context that the Pynchon wiki is putting it in, is that maybe like descending, once you reach that zenith point, are you then descending into a sort of hell, or what might be analogous to a hell in this kind of situation? Or with you just mentioned the going up and that kind of entering into another world thing. If we keep in mind that at the time that this story is taking place, the general concept, the generally widely accepted idea of what existed outside of the earth was what was referred to as the luminous ether. And it was essentially almost like a liquid, that space was this, almost alcoholish liquid that you would have to travel through. And so at that point, like, are you getting to a point where you've descended, or you've ascended, and you hit that point where the atmosphere becomes the ether, and then now you're into this vast openness, and there's no more up and down. There's a lot of different ways to interpret it, but that's the two that I was kind of focused on.
So, in order to give my thoughts on that bit, I'll have to step back a page and point out the hydrogen generating apparatus and the screw. That line is, "It had been a night of sleepless precaution, lest sparks from the torches of the mob drift anywhere near the hydrogen-generating apparatus and devastation result." In time, however, the ominously cloaked rustics, perhaps in superstitious fear of that very machinery, had dispersed to their homes and haunts, and Chick Counterfly, for better or worse, had remained. The reason that's relevant is the previous depiction of the screw as being described as nothing more than a perpetual motion machine. Now, it's not explicitly said here, and I don't think it is later in the book. I think it's left ambiguous, but it's kind of implied between those two that the screw is also doing that hydrogen generation. And so the way I take the going up is going down again is to look at the fact that you cannot have hydrogen generation without energy input in the first place, which means that you cannot generate hydrogen with a thing that is pushing you forward. So while these chums of chance are both being inflated, or not inflated, being suspended and lifted above into the altitude and the hypothetical in the context of the conversation we're discussing, the north in a way, they are also being propelled across real space beneath them by this same imaginary component. And when you are discussing when they discuss, sorry, but in general, when anyone discusses going to the North Pole and always going south, talking about going north is analogous, or going up is analogous to going north, it very reminiscent to me of the entire idea of projecting a map onto the globe and vice versa, and the kinds of tricks and distortions you have to allow to enter into your intuitive reasoning about space. Because in a sense, we are always trying to force three-dimensional space into this understanding of space that we have intuitively, which is one that, what's the word? What's the name I'm looking for? But there are different forms of projecting geometries, and the geometry that we live in is not the geometry of our real world, in the sense that you turn 90 degrees on the planet, you're not turning right on the map. You're turning slightly more or slightly less depending on where you are in terms of altitude, in terms of all of these various specifics, because of the fact that when we are walking on a flat plane, but it's not flat, it's curved at a certain degree. Yada, yada, yada. So if anyone hates when I get into these very discursive and very totalizing interpretations, I apologize. That's what this book is going to be as far as my input.
That actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Especially, looking at it from the perspective that they're looking at it from being an aeronautics sort of society and flying around in an airship. Makes a lot of sense in particular. Do we have any last thoughts on this first chapter that we want to talk about before we move on to chapter 2?
We did skip over the fact that Chick's father tried to sell Mississippi to Mexico.
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
Which I'll just read that line real quick. Upon the imminent arrival of a posse comitatus, excuse me, who had learned of his attempted scheme to sell the state of Mississippi to a mysterious Chinese consortium based in Tijuana, Mexico, Dick Counterfly had absquatulated swiftly into the night, leaving his son with only a pocketful of specie and the tender admonition, "Gotta scram, kid, right if you get work." And absquatulate is a great word too. So
It is. It is a great old-timey word. And the thing that I appreciate about this book too, and his usage of sort of words of the period, is that he places them in a context where it's easy enough to understand what he is actually saying. Because I don't think most people reading this book in 2009 or now would just know off the top of their head what absquatulate actually means.
It's like The Simpsons does the same thing with Mr. Burns, right? Where he's constantly using these terms from the turn of the century that no one knows nowadays, but you can at least kind of grok what he's getting at.
Yeah, exactly. Moving on to chapter 2, the Chums of Chance find themselves coming into Chicago, and we get some lovely descriptions of the city itself. In particular, I love the way that this chapter opens, where it says, "As they came in low over the stockyards, the smell found them. The smell in the upper of flesh learning its mortality, like the dark conjugate of some daylight fiction they had flown here, as appeared increasingly likely to help promote. Somewhere down there was the White City promised in the Columbian Exposition brochures. Somewhere among butchery unrelenting, the tall smokestacks unceasingly vomiting black grease smoke, into which the buildings of the leagues of city lying downwind retreated like children into sleep which bringeth not reprieve from the day. In the stockyards, workers coming off shift, overwhelmingly of the Roman faith, able to detach from earth and blood for a few precious seconds, looking up at the airship in wonder, imagining a detachment of not necessarily helpful angels." I love this particular quote because it's a really visceral description of like the consequences of industry and the modernity that Pynchon starts describing in Mason and Dixon as moving forward, coming to a more sort of familiar head. He makes the city seem like gross and dingy, and it's completely black. It's blackened by like the soot of factories, and it's blackened by sort of again this concept of like industry itself. And then at the heart of all of that, somewhere buried is this white city, this place that is supposed to be sort of, you know, in the minds of the people attending, like this great liberation from the blackness of the place they actually live in. But in actuality, of course, again, getting into this sort of duality and the struggle of good and evil, all of these inventors and creators who are showcasing work at the White City are doing so for the express purposes of making money and of forwarding the agendas of this sort of industrialized society that is creating this kind of disgusting environment that the people are living in. And then, you know, saying that a lot of these people, the only thing they really have in their lives that kind of helps lift them out of that is religion, is an insightful comment on the role of religion in modern society as a whole. But then turning that around to the Chums of Chance once again is them looking up and thinking to themselves, "Oh, are those angels? No, it's just more like technology." And it specifically says here, imagining a detachment of not necessarily helpful angels, which again is not only just sort of a funny line, but what gets this idea of like, what are the Chums of Chance? What do they actually represent? What is the organization they work for up to? He keeps planting these sort of seeds of not everything with these people is exactly what they seem, and he'll get into that again when we get the description of the two people chasing one another through the city. That isn't it for a couple of pages, and they start to come into the city and close to sundown. In the south side of the city, they find a prairie where they're going to set down their balloon amongst all of the other people gathering for the gathering, the International Gathering of Aeronauts, or the Great International Gathering of Aeronauts, rather, it's described here, which is being held in conjunction with the World's Fair. As Professor, which is apparently actually the title given to people who would like fly around at this time. For whatever reason, Professor was the chosen name for people who piloted like balloons or, you know, any of these like early flying devices. I don't know why, but that's why he's called that. Wants them to prepare to descend, and then things don't go well with their with their descension. And I love the way that it's introduced, where it says, "Indeed, the well-meaning but far from dexterous Miles Blundell had somehow contrived to wrap the pole rope leading to the valve mechanism around his foot, and could be seen moving that extremity to and fro, the bewildered look on his wide, honest face, in hopes that the spring-loaded valve would thus somehow close again, for it had already allowed an enormous quantity of hydrogen gas to escape the envelope in a sudden rush, causing the ship to plummet toward the lakeside like a toy dropped by some cosmic urchin." Which just the what that must look like. Just a guy who is more or less described as an idiot from a perspective of the actual words used here. Well-meaning, but less than dexterous, an honest face, just like a real country bumpkin.
Well, that's I mean, again,
Yeah.
this is how those books were written, you know, and
Yeah.
you can go back a line before where Lindsay is warning everyone of what's about to happen. Is as I'm sure it has not escaped your attention, Blundel's ineptness with the main valve, grown I fear habitual, has increased the speed of our descent to a notable, if not in fact alarming degree. Like, such a long way to go to just say, hey guys, we got serious problem right now. Blundell fucked up real bad. We're all
He's-
screwed.
But I also want to. I also just love picturing in my head the idea of somebody with a rope, just managing to get a rope tied around their foot, but then their thought on how to solve that problem is to just like wildly flail their leg around to try and get it off of him, like it's some kind of a snake or something. Yeah, you have it in the notes that it's very Looney Tunes-esque, which is very true. Or you actually have that a little bit further on, but
There's another part too, but that fits here too.
This is certainly Looney Tunes-esque in many ways.
And then for Miles to just say, it just got tangled up, Professor. Whoops.
It's really great. Yeah. And then so they do eventually right their ship, and they manage to get their self down, and then there's a callback to the previous discussion on sort of like profanity and usage of language here in page 11 that I enjoyed, where it says his broodful reflections were interrupted by Darby running over to tug at the sleeve of his blazer. Professor, Lindsay has just now made a defamatory remark about Miles's mother, yet he's forever after me about using slang. And is that fair, I ask you? Just the humor employed in how he's writing these sentences to get to your
good.
point, Cody, of not only like dealing with the language of the time or how those books of the time are written, but turning that on its head to write a joke about the concept of like yo mama jokes, which he must enjoy those quite a bit, because
for sure.
this is not the first book that we've talked about Pynchon and yo mama jokes in, but it's just it's very funny. That line of just has just now made a defamatory remark about Miles' mother, yet he's forever after me about using slang. And is that fair, I ask you? It's very, very good. And I'm sure that stuff continues on through the whole book in quite an enjoyable way.
Yes, it does.
And after they manage to settle that particular sort of, I guess, kerfuffle, they set up their camp, but not before they notice that there is a naked woman, and there is an eager stampede, as it's said, to the rail in a joint attempt to wrest the telescope from Miles, whoever clung to it stubbornly, all meanwhile stared or squinted avidly, attempting to verify the reported apparition. And this is where we get an interesting sort of aside or to sort of paragraph here, where it's very beautifully written. Basically, in order to solve the issue they're having, they cut all of their ballast bags, and so Pynchon describes the kind of star-shaped explosion of ballast on the ground from where they dropped, but then also describes that amongst that there is this couple, I guess is the right way to put it, where a naked woman is running, and there's a man running, and there is behind him a female companion carrying a bundle of ladies' apparel, though clad at the moment in little beyond a floral diadem of sort, charmingly askew among masses of fair hair. So, like, this couple running through the streets, or just outside the streets of Chicago, rather, seeming to be naked but carrying clothes. The Pynchon Wiki talks about this as potentially like an allusion to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Certainly some of that would make sense. Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden in part because they noticed that they were naked, and in this case, we're trying to cover up their nakedness. Here we have this couple who is naked but holding clothes and running out of a city that is currently hosting the World's Fair, which is kind of seen as a Edenic. A lot of these were seen as like Edenic ideals of what cities could be. For like what a lot of people don't maybe know is that Epcot was designed as like a World's Fair potentiality for like a utopian perfect city, and Disney has just kept it around. So there is certainly some point to that, but then it describes there's a line here. The duo appeared to be making for a nearby patch of woods, now and then casting apprehensive looks upward at the enormous gas bag of the descending inconvenience. quite as if it were some giant eyeball, perhaps that of society itself, ever scrutinizing from above in a spirit of constructive censure. So I wanted to ask you guys what you think is being meant here by Pynchon with this
Oh.
couple running out of the city, and then also with the
It's-
description of the ship.
It's right there in the beginning of that paragraph. At least for me, it is where it talks about the stout gentleman in a Norfolk jacket and +4 is clutching a straw skimmer to the back of his head with one hand, while the other keeping balanced upon his shoulder a photographic camera and tripod. They're making porn.
Oh, okay.
Or the camera gets invented, and now you have the ability to do this and profit off of it. But you need a private, secluded place to do that, like in the woods, until someone encroaches on that and becomes a giant eyeball for seeing everything that you're doing.
Sure. That makes a lot of sense.
I would expand it even further to not just making porn, because that's part of it. I don't even know that it's necessarily pornography. It might be genuinely artistic photos.
For sure.
Yeah, and it's about the fact that now first of all, in the scene we don't see of them just taking photos in the woods or whatever, in the fields, she's happy to be photographed by this guy, but suddenly giant eye, as it's described overhead. There's a threat to that ability to allow who you want to see your privacy.
Yeah, that's a great way to.
The section does remind me of the movie Pearl a little bit, which I think is set later. I think it's set in the early 20th century, but it also explores, like this kind of stuff with the creation of porn and the the differences between before photography and after photography, and before motion pictures and after motion pictures.
Yeah, I definitely think there is the possibility that what they're doing is just art, as Will said. I draw the line to it being porn just based on the fact that they're at the World's Fair and are more than likely, it's kind of implied, probably going to be trying to find a way to sell it. And, that's going to sell better than just art, especially at a place like that.
Yeah, no, I'm not pushing back. I think it could be porn. I think that would make just as much sense.
Yeah, fair enough. And I mean, again, getting back to this idea of who are the Chums of Chance, what do they represent? There seems to be a very clear line that Pynchon is drawing of them in this case being seen as like a government apparatus or a censure board of some kind. Again, it's that slow widening of the camera, not just to show the landscape, but also now how people are maybe going to react to their appearance in some way by depicting them as almost like a giant eyeball censoring their activity. It's a very, very excellent way to put it.
I do also want to jump back a page because we did miss the first mention of the Riemann hypothesis. That's going to be very, very important going through the rest of this book. On page 12, it's a really just one-off quick thing where they are talking about taking corrective action against Miles for his error, as we'll call it. And they're basically talking about like tying him up in the I think they were going to use the parachute lines or something. But there's a line that says, moreover, the complexities that would attend rigging Blundell and the necessary paraphernalia would tax the topological genius of Herr Riemann himself. I fully intended to, prior to going into this book, really familiarize myself with the Riemann hypothesis, and had gotten myself a book on it from the library, and I got about a quarter of the way through it and found out that the author is a huge racist.
Oh,
to put that one away. So I will go back to it. I've been watching some YouTube videos on it. It's a very complicated and complex mathematical thing that is not easy to really distill into a simple explanation. And I'm not great with math, but I want to learn more about this. So I think as we go through the book, I will hopefully have a little bit of a better understanding of it and be able to more accurately explain it. If anyone listening has a good way to distill the information of the Riemann hypothesis and its importance to this story, please let us know. I would love to get other people's opinions on that, but the Riemann hypothesis is going to come up a lot more as the book goes on.
Yeah, just looking at the definition provided off of like Google, I don't even know what any of this means. I'm just as bad at math.
In a very macro sense, it has to do with the understanding the placement of prime numbers as they occur and the ability to kind of predict them. But then it also has to do with there's zero theorem comes into weird play. There's a lot more to it, but yeah, it seems really interesting. And it's like it's essentially the unsolved math problem that still remains.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I've all of my spare time in the past 6 weeks or so has been spent trying to learn as much as I can about that facet of mathematics.
I think you genuinely
It's,
have to have like a degree in mathematics to even begin to understand what the fuck is going on with it.
It is one of those things where if you spend the time to learn how to intuit this aspect of mathematics, it begins to be far less confusing. But
Oh,
it
I'm
is
sure,
just,
yeah.
it's just immersion.
You just have to have a fundamental understanding of the base that forms this whole giant kind of concept. Yeah.
Yeah, and the way we teach math these days really undermines
Oh, yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Fascinating. I'm not gonna lie. I thought he made that up for the book. when
Oh.
I read that name, I was like, "Yeah, that's probably just some Pynchon. That's probably just some Pynchon stuff."
Nope. No, that's a very real thing. Yeah, it remains like I think it's still considered to be like the most notorious unsolved math problem that still exists.
Yeah, I mean, I think the zeta function plotted on a two-dimensional graph might actually be the structure of this novel in the same way that the Mobius strip might be for Mason and Dixon and the parabola is for Gravity's Rainbow. Like I think it's
That's very
important
possible,
to
yeah.
the book.
I mean, if it is informing how the characters are making decisions, that would make sense. We do get a description of some good food, which is great.
Mhm.
After they set down their airship and set up their camp, it says here that Miles busied himself in the miniature galley and soon had fried them up a quote-unquote mess of catfish. Caught that morning and kept all day on ice whose melting had been retarded by the frigidity of altitude. Around them, the other groups of Sky Brothers were busy at their own culinary arrangements and roasting meat, frying onions, and baking bread, sent delicious odors creeping everywhere about the great encampment. That just sounds wonderful.
Wonderful, yeah.
Yeah. Then, sure enough, we do get a song already on page 15. Cody, you've entitled this as "Time to Song."
Yes,
You've come
that
up
is
with
the
an
new
acronym
terminology.
acronym for it.
Phenomenon. Yes. And I'm pretty sure this is the fastest TTS that we have so far.
Yeah,
And I think that we will have. I don't think any of the books we haven't covered get to it faster.
it takes like 90 pages before one in Bleeding Edge.
Mm-hmm.
It takes
I
almost.
think Gravity's Rainbow might be second. I think there's a song pretty quick in there, but it's not 15 pages.
Yeah, I believe you're correct. 15 pages is probably the quickest that we get to one. And I actually don't hate this one.
It's pretty good.
Yeah, as kind of an overall hater of the inclusion of the songs in Binchon books, this one, I can imagine in my head what it sounds like, which I usually have some. Yeah, I usually have some difficulty with that with a lot of his other songs that he comes up with, and it's kind of funny, and it's also kind of neat in its imagery, calling them the vagabonds of the void.
Mm-hmm.
Nights growing dark as can be, let the lightning flash and the thunder thrash. Oh, only cheerful young hearts have we. It's nice.
Yeah.
And we learn that Chick and Darby are being the port section of the crew specifically is what they comprise, and they have watch duty while Miles and Lindsay are going to be allowed ground leave to Chicago. They are going to head out to the exposition. We get a we get a depiction of what their dress uniforms might be. There's leggings. There's a neckerchief that needs to be knotted with symmetry. There is a dickie with 44 buttons, one for each state of the union, which says a lot about who these people are. If you're so kind of invested in the American, I don't even know, like imagery, because they also have like bunting on their uniforms.
Yeah.
Which if you don't know what that is, it's sort of those, if I'm not mistaken, it's sort of those like half circle like flags that get put out during like 4th of July and like other patriotic stuff.
Yeah.
That's part of their uniform.
It's very garish. That's in a very fun way. It's incredibly garish.
They would probably look like the Rockettes, but dressed more covered, I guess would be the way that I would
Yeah.
put it.
Yeah.
It's like a hyper patriotic, hyper militaristic version of the Boy Scouts uniform almost.
There you go.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there you
The
go.
Boy
That
Scouts.
might be a
If
better
you
one.
combine the Boy Scouts and like the Royal Guard or something.
Yeah. Yeah, the
Yeah.
Boy Scouts and ROTC.
Well, because like a 44 button Dickie, all I can think of is like a Civil War officer's
Yeah.
uniform.
Yeah.
Right. Which probably, given the time frame, is not too far off what
No.
this
No.
looks like. Given that it's only about, 20 some years after the Civil War is over. Or 30, almost 30 years after the Civil
Yeah.
War is over. Yeah. We then get a description of some Makassar oil being added to their hair. This is an old school hair product that was sort of meant to keep hair sort of like greased and shiny looking, but also offered some hold for styling. And then when Miles had been rendered as fit to be seen by the populace of the Windy City as he ever would be, the two boys came smartly to attention, dressing right at close interval in the circle of firelight to await inspection. Pugnax joined them, tail still, gaze expectant. Randolph emerged from his tent in mufti every bit as spruce as his Liberty section, for he too was bound for earthly chores, his chums of chance flight uniform having been replaced by a tastefully checkered Kentucky hemp suit with ascot tie and a snappy fedora topping off the ensemble. So we get an idea that they... Yeah, Cody?
I can't help but imagine Paul F. Tompkins wearing something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
sure Paul F. Tompkins has that in his
Probably
closet.
that suit, yeah.
In probably multiple colors. Certainly. So
If you get an adaptation of this, that's our Randolph right there.
Randolph is Paul F. Tompkins. That's what I'm going to have to picture going
A
forward, I think.
50-something-year-old teen boy wonder.
Yes, yeah, exactly. With the mustache and everything.
of course.
Speakeasy era Paul F. Tompkins leading an airship. And they are inspected by Randolph. They say that Randolph seems like he's going to go meet a woman. We of course know that isn't technically true, although he does meet one. And the sort of warning that he gives them, for lack of kind of reading the whole quote. I guess it's actually not that bad. Does someone want to read that quote on 16, starting with about the fringes?
About the fringes, Randolph reminded the Liberty goers of any gathering on the scale of this exposition are apt to lurk vicious and debased elements whose sole aim is to take advantage of the unwary. I will not dignify it by naming that sinister quarter where such dangers are most probably to be encountered. The very vulgarity of its aspect, particularly by night, will speak for itself, disinclining all but the most reckless of their well-being to linger in contemplation upon, much less actually investigate, the unprofitable delights offered therein. A word to the wise, or in this case, howsoever, good liberty, boys, I say, and good luck. Wherewith Randolph saluted, turned, and vanished soundlessly into the great fragrant darkness.
So this is an interesting quote because obviously, as I previously had mentioned, the first American serial killer was at the World's Fair. A man by the name of H.H. Holmes, who operated a Scooby-Doo manner that actually killed
Jesus,
people, is really the best way that I can put it. Essentially, what he would do is he would go to the fairgrounds and he would lure tourists and unsuspecting people away from the fair by saying that he had a mansion that they could stay in, and then would guide them down corridors that went nowhere to rooms that had trapdoors in them and all sorts of stuff that, reading the description of it, like, you can see how it would how it would sound a bit goofy, but was in actuality a horror house, to use Cody's phrase there. H.H. Holmes claims to have killed 200 people with his house. That was not proven in the court cases. Initially, the estimate, I want to say, was like somewhere initially around the 80s, like 86 people, and then eventually ended up more so in like the 30s. And then nowadays, some people have said that he maybe only killed 9 people. At any rate, just how many people he killed is kind of irrelevant. It is some of the real history behind kind of what comes to mind when you hear him bring this up. I think in actuality, though, if we take in context the next scenes where they go to the fairgrounds, What he is probably more so talking about is the non-white elements of the fair that exist outside of the main sort of portion of it. And so we once again, I think, end up with a perspective of, as we'll talk about, I'm sure, when we get to that section, this kind of inherent racism of the time. You know, when you're going to the fair, there's this dark portion of it that is just there to kind of lure you away and take your money or harm you, when in actuality it's people of a different cultural background. While in the main fairgrounds that's supposed to be safe and sort of lovely and wonderful, you have a white guy stalking around trying to get you to come back to his house so he can kill you with a spike pit. So once again, getting into like the cultural differences of the time to nowadays, some of the inherent racism baked into the way that people behaved then versus now. And again, that dichotomy and that dark and light that he's already playing with here in the first 20 pages of the novel, of sort of the duality of things, but then also the literal usages of the words like white city or dark fringes, things like that. So the kids head out, but not before we get a reference to the fact that they are not allowed to smoke on board, but they do have is it Sububs? Cububs? I'm not sure.
Cubeb.
Cubeb.
Okay.
Yeah. They have Cubeb cigarettes, which are referenced here as a medicinal sort of
That's what they were. I mean,
medicinal-
technically, they were considered to be medicinal.
Yeah, it was he says that it's a cure for something, right? In
It's
here?
well to be fair, at the time, people thought heroin and cocaine were cures for things too. So
That's fair.
take it
Yeah.
with a grain of salt. But yeah, it was I think it was supposed to cure like throat ailments or the opposite of what you would think, when you're smoking something would actually do. What I thought was interesting that I found out was that Edgar Rice Burroughs apparently smoked a lot of Cubebs to the point where he said that if he hadn't smoked as many as he had, there would never have been a Tarzan, which makes kind of an interesting link here, given the adventuring style that these are written in is kind of similar to those books.
Yeah.
Let me see. I'm pulling up the Cubebs thing right now. Frequently used in the form of cigarettes for asthma, chronic pharyngitis, and hay fever.
Yeah, that is yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Oh, you have asthma? Smoke this.
Smoke this. Put this
Take
smoke in your chest.
what you need is some smoke in your lungs to really clear out the demons that are causing your asthma.
It'll burn out the bed.
Yeah, if you fumigate your inner chest cavity, nothing can live in there.
Yeah, so just, I guess, context. Cubeb, looking at what makes up the essential oils, probably, and you can find this out if you go looking around, dear listeners, but smoking a Cubeb cigarette probably was a lot like, the smell of incense at a church. It was a lot like black pepper and clove components in terms of the volatile oils. So, I mean, it might actually be an effective expectorant. It apparently was used for gonorrhea treatment, and I would believe it
Okay.
kind of works.
I think we all just need to return to the medicinal cures of this age. You go to the
Right.
soda fountain, you get cocaine in a beverage.
Yeah.
If you were in pain, they just give you heroin at the
If you had
hospital.
rheumatism, you just have some opium.
Yeah. Yeah. What a truly gilded era for the country.
Right.
In between the Cubeb that they're sharing, they suddenly find out that the dog is beginning to bark at a stranger out in the fragrant darkness, and this stranger throws a stake in a perfect arc that it lands directly in front of Pugnax.
Saying, here
Which-
you go, nice doggy. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the Looney Tunes thing that I had.
I do love the imagery of dark, like the way that it's written is that it seems like it's so dark you can't see 2 feet in front of you,
Yeah.
and just out of that darkness comes a perfectly cooked like T-bone that flies through the air in like a very perfect parabola, and it lands right between the dog's feet, and then just that voice from the outer dark says, "Here you go, nice doggy." We learned that these are not people, coming to rob them or engage in any general vagabondry, but another group of aeronautic society members. These ones, as members of Bindle Stiffs of the Blue AC, a club of ascensionaries from Oregon with whom the chums of chance had often flown on joint maneuvers, broke into a welcoming smile, especially for Miss Penelope Penny Black, whose elfin appearance disguised an intrepid spirit and unfaltering will. So this is our first introduction to another group of people that exist doing the same thing. They're described interestingly with a bit more of a kind of Middle Eastern flair. They wear something much like a fez and are wearing indigo mohair suits with scarlet pinstripes. Like, just the outrageous outfits that these clubs wear are really something.
It's a Biggles novel. That's essentially what we're playing with here. It's Biggles at the fair.
Yeah, that's very true. They sort of talk about their journey to the festival as well, and then they make a mention of some stuff going on in the air. There's a reference here to galvanic halos. Then they also mention that they dodged tornadoes all day. If you go to Oklahoma, you'll hear some real weird wind that will drown out any strange voices. But specifically, there's this concept reported of sightings that seem to be sort of strange and different from things they normally encounter. Lights and sounds in upper altitudes that sound like voices calling out together all directions at once, like a school choir, only no tune, just these, one of them says, warnings. I'm sure that this is going to be talked about later in the book. Do we want to discuss this at all, or is doing so going to get into spoiler stuff?
I mean, we can keep it to just how it appears in this chapter, and I think it's a really, this harkens back to the, like in Mason and Dixon, where you had that sort of Lovecraftian ambient terror that's there, almost like the earth itself is a living entity that is, creating this ominous feeling.
Yeah.
And I think that's especially evident in it right towards the end, where Penny says, we happened to be up with him that one day, and it was just kind of the queerest thing. Nobody saw any projectiles, but there was a kind of force, energy we could feel directed personally at us. It gives that same sort of air of, this is the earth kind of starting to awaken and wanting to counteract the things that are happening to it, this destruction of the natural environment to make way for this modernity and this progress and the city building that's happening at such a fast rate. And now, this looming thing underneath is finally starting to kind of make its presence known.
Yeah. And I think that it's interesting that he does it based upon like the milieu where the developments are happening, right? Like like in Mason and Dixon, like you talked about, it's the land itself. They're drawing that scar across the back of the dragon, and so like something in the wind through the trees causes people to like go insane, or sort of rejects or is trying to reject what humanity is trying to put into it in that pursuit of modernity. But now it's in the air, and it's these like voices that are trying to like drive you insane, or these strange like choruses of noises or coronas of light or things like that are trying to kind of push you out. It's almost like white blood cells responding to a different kind of infection.
Yeah,
it's really quite good stuff. Which is followed up by even more good stuff where Pynchon kind of briefly talks about the sieges of Paris that occurred in the 1870s, 1871 in particular. And there's a line in here: as the ordeal went on, it became clear certain of these balloonists observing from above and poised ever upon cusp of mortal danger how much the modern state depended for its survival on maintaining a condition of permanent siege through the systematic encirclement of populations, the starvation of bodies and spirits, the relentless degradation of civility until citizen was turned against citizen, even to the point of committing atrocities like those of the infamous Pechelures of Paris. This feels especially relevant after us reading Bleeding Edge, because that's a lot of what we talked about in Bleeding Edge, this idea that if you can put your society into a state of, we didn't exactly say it like that when we were talking about Bleeding Edge, but permanent siege, that gives you the ability to do whatever you want. right?
Mm.
As long as the government is protecting its populace by coming up with an enemy or by putting it into a state of permanent war, then it can. There's nothing it can't do. There's nothing it can't justify, and certainly Pynchon would have had that on his mind in the time frame that he must have been writing this book because of Iraq and Afghanistan breaking out in the wake of 9/11 having occurred. And I think, again, kind of getting into, I think a lot of this book, if I were to guess, kind of expands the stuff in Mason and Dixon in particular as it relates to Pynchon and his thought processes around like Ludditism and, what resistance to modernity would look like. And so that this page ends with, when the siege is ended, these balloonists chose to fly on, free now of the political delusions that reign more than ever on the ground, pledged solemnly only to one another, proceeding as if under a worldwide, never-ending state of siege. So this idea of like the only way to escape modernity is to wage war on it. The Luddites broke the weaving frames as a way to wage war on sort of the progress there. But then, of course, with what is being alluded to with these different aeronautics clubs, it's already been co-opted. Like, it's already been infected by that counterforce and turned into something else. It started as government resistance, but is now seemingly government censorship or government supported activity. There's just a lot of interesting ideas that he's laying the foundation for in the first 20 pages of this book.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the reference to Bleeding Edge is a good one, because the fact this book came out in 2006, that would have been around the height of, I think 2006 2007 was probably the height of the Iraq War, when it was in the news a lot and stuff, with the battles of Fallujah and different stuff. That quote the first quote you gave out, the one with citizen turned against citizen and all that, it does remind me of the fact that after the Cold War ended, we had the 90s, where I do think I was a kid during the 90s. I wasn't super socially conscious, but I do think that there was kind of a rising action in terms of terrorism being the new bogeyman, as opposed to Russia or communism being the bogeyman.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Then after 2001, that would have definitely, after 9/11, that would have definitely been ramped up to a very like an extreme. And I do think that quote is probably related to that, where people there. I think more recently there's been a pretty big movement to view Gravity's Rainbow as a commentary on the 60s and early 70s, like the time period it was written in. And I'm not 100% I'm not like fully on board with that. I'm kind of on board with that. I'm not, and we'll get to that when we get to Gravity's Rainbow. But I do think that this quote is definitely a commentary on the time period of this book's publication.
Mm-hmm. And the Pynchon wiki to support sort of what you just talked about, Luke, makes mention of the fact that the Amazon description for this book was written by Thomas Pynchon, which I didn't know. And he does seem to make a joke in his description that like any references in this book to the modern landscape should be seen as incidental or something like that.
Yeah.
Which very clearly is not true, and is instead him making a deliberate commentary, or like the publisher's description or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it was, but yeah, I think you're exactly correct that to read it as anything other than a commentary on the landscape that he wrote it in, and that is still just as relevant now, almost 20 years later, it is pretty much the right way to look at that.
I can tie this all back to Cody's idea of Pugnax as the reader.
Okay.
So, first of all, the idea that Pugnax barks in a choir of barks, like the many readers of books. But here you go, called an invisible voice. Nice doggy. Pugnax stood his ground, but has ceased barking. A giant beefsteak strung in an arc, slowly rotating, and hit the dirt almost exactly between Pugnax's front paws. And then in walk these people who are dressed in similar outfits to the Chums of Chance, except and you said it was Eastern influenced, Kate. I think it is more Germanic, and it literally says German style with a bunch of pale eclipse green plumes, which is very much the sort of headdress that would have been in the fashion in the late 1800s among German military. And
Okay.
then further along, Penny is described as, and this is where it gets into real numerology with words. She is described as having an intrepid spirit and unfaltering will, and being somebody who Darby has had a case on as long as he can remember. Spirit and will are in the titles of two very important early 19th century philosophical texts from Germany. The Phenomenology of the Spirit from Georg Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel, and Arthur Schopenhauer's The Will and Its Representation. And then Case is highlighted there, which is in the style of an adventure novel, according, but it's also, for everyone out there who's read V, The World is Everything That Is the Case, is a fairly important work of modernist German philosophy in the form of Ludwig Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. And they are from Oregon, which was established as the first white supremacist colony of the United States.
That's true.
And you loop all of that in with the very direct discussion of the Garçon de 71, which I think connecting that to Gravity's Rainbow makes a lot of sense, because, he was probably finishing up the book in 1971, if not already submitting it to editors. And so much of that, I think, in that very blurred out way, can be read as saying the Chums of Chance are a more American, more patriotic version of me, the author, whereas these folks represent my perspective from back in the 60s and early 70s,
Oh,
maybe.
okay.
Because it's pretty well known that anyone read Gravity's Rainbow knows Pynchon loved German philosophy at that period of time, or at least learned a lot about it. Again, numerology with words, but that's my numerology.
I'm gonna have to think about it, but that makes sense in my head the way that you've described it for sure. Which so what do you think the within that kind of idea? What do you think the pacification of the reader would mean if Pugnax is sort of a sit-in for the reader? Because Pugnax's response is initially aggressive and then is placated by the meat being thrown at it.
Well, we're just all sorts of dogs waiting for someone as well equipped with a big old steak as Penny and or Pynchon.
Yeah.
And this book is the next steak. When you're doing such frivolous thought as just search and replace words with other words, as I have, what I don't think you can really try to draw a direct analog between those kinds of things.
Yeah, fair. I mean, you say that though, and your explanation would make perfect sense. Yeah, no, that's an interesting way to look at it for sure. Chapter 3 ends up with Miles and Lindsay headed off to the fair. They take as it's put here, a horse-drawn conveyance, which takes them through the streets of southern Chicago, and they eventually arrive at the fair, but not before talking about the concern over leaving Counterfly with full run of the ship and no one to supervise him. Their opinions of each other is interesting. None of the individual chums seem to think that the other chums are any particular good. And they, because there's another line in here too, as Master of Arms, muttered Lindsay, perhaps only to himself, my own view of human nature is necessarily less hopeful. Which is just a great line. They get deposited at a place that's a short walk to the fairgrounds, and they find a gap in the fence where they climb in, and they end up at an admissions gate lit by a single candle stub whose attendant, a scowling Asiatic midget of some sort, though eager enough to take their proffered 50-cent pieces, had to be pressed by the scrupulous Lindsay for a duly executed receipt. The Dominion of Sentinel then held out his palm as if for a gratuity, which the boys ignored. Dead beats, he screamed. by way of introducing them to the quatrecennial celebration of Columbus's advent upon our shores. Which makes me wonder, are they submitting expenses? What, like,
so.
why?
I think that's exactly what that is.
Why do they need a receipt? Like that, and that brings up just a whole lot of questions. Who's approving their expense reports? Why are they getting paid out for attending the World's Fair? But just the concept of these ostensibly children submitting expense reports for their aeronautic vacations or adventures rather is very funny. We get a reference to Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. This is another thing related to the 93 World's Fair. Buffalo Bill wasn't allowed in, which was strange apparently for the time, because he had been a part of other ones in the past, and also his Wild West show was very, very popular amongst the general public of America at the time, and so he had to set up his show outside the World's Fair. So they passed through that, and its unmistakable scent of massed livestock. And here's where we get to this sort of dark outer fairgrounds portion. And there's a lot of stuff to talk about in here, certainly, because it deals with a lot of different things that Pynchon has talked about over the course of the novels that we have read, but also his sort of entire career. And we get these descriptions of, quote, cultural darkness and savagery, a separate lampless world with its own economic life, social habits, and we get descriptions of people grimacing, staring directly at them as if they knew them, as if in the boys' long career of adventure in exotic corners of the world, there had been accumulating, unbeknownst to them, a reserve of mistranslation, offense taken, debt entered into, here being re-expressed as a strange limbo they must negotiate their way through. This makes me think of that concept of karmic debt that we talked about in Bleeding Edge.
Mhm.
This idea that Windust has this karmic debt that follows him around because of the things that he has done, and that at a certain point, somebody is going to come and tabulate that, and his bill for that debt is gonna really come due. It is unlikely, of course, that these particular boys have met any of these performers outside of the World's Fair, but what they represent certainly has. And this is again where it gets into this like darker or seedier element of what the Chums of Chance may represent from a perspective of an extension of sort of the colonial American project or the colonial Western project, the subjugation of second and third world countries by first world countries, the cultural exploitation and sort of selling back culture to its own residences that would follow as a result of industrialization and subjugation and slavery certainly earlier than this, and all of the different aspects of how this modern world has been built. And you have these two characters that are like literally wrapped in imagery related to the American country, the American continent, going to a fair that represents 400 years of that continent's sort of renaming and established existence. And so in that instance, all of that ire is turned directly on them as literal symbols of that. And we get a couple of different interesting like things that are talked about here. There's a Zulu theatrical company reenacting the massacre of British troops at Ishwandlwana. I'm sure I mispronounced that. That's a very famous moment in history where a Zulu tribe was able to hold, of like 800 or something like that, was able to hold off the like entire British colonial forces. And I think the Pynchon Wiki and Wikipedia says they killed like 15,000 British troops.
Insane high number. Yeah.
It is seen as one of the greatest military disasters in history, from a perspective of like a much bigger military power completely not only losing but being insanely beaten by a from a perspective of like might and ability with armament, a much inferior foe. So we have like a literal reenactment of violent uprising against colonial power happening. Then we also have we have pygmies singing Christian hymns in pygmy dialect. So we have an illustration of religious subjugation through colonialism being put on display. We also have Brazilian Indians being swallowed by giant anacondas only to climb out again, undigested and apparently with no discomfort to the snake. Indian swamis levitating, Chinese boxers fainting, kicking, and throwing one another to and fro. So we have this case of these sort of like traditional cultures being sold as tourism. Like you're here to watch this take place for your enjoyment, for something to make money off of. Like it's a dumb song because I don't think anyone in this band is Native American. But Paul Revere and the Raiders had a song called Indian Nation that, like, a lot of the lyrics in that are talking about it. Like how eventually, when a culture is completely absorbed, like their beads that they used to make by hand are now made in Japan, and a lot of other things like that get sold back to the people who are sort of taking advantage of them. And then we get to another example of this here, where it says, "Here were Waziris from Waziristan exhibiting upon one another various techniques for waylaying travelers, which reckon in that country as a major source of income." It's a capitalist fair. It's a fair about commerce. So if the way that you make money is by waylaying travelers, that's what you show up at the fair to sort of showcase. So it's this very and there's a lot more examples that show up here as they go through this kind of outer portions of the fair until they get to the next scene with the 3-card Monty, which we'll talk about. But it's just such a brilliant dissection of a lot of these themes that we've already talked about in this episode, from a perspective of the duality of the fair itself, the duality of the time period, the duality of these colonial subjects and historically like repressed peoples trying to make money off of their own culture, which is inherently a Western concept, and these concepts of the fair itself representing that expansion of modernity, but only for certain people. And the people that it excludes are out on the outskirts, trying to do the same thing, but to little to no effect. It's just a genius section that comes so early in this book, related to the length of the whole thing.
Yeah, it reminded me a lot of Mason and Dixon coming off the boat and entering into Philadelphia, and just all the everything, everyone peddling their things and their wares and their medicines and what have you, and just kind of throwing everything into your face, and how, if you're not expecting that to be what you're presented with, how jarring that must be. And for a lot of people coming to this is their first interaction with anyone from outside of their very local area. This was before world travel was really possible on a, widely accessible scale. So to have all these people from different parts of the world, must have just been this, overwhelming and insane kind of experience to have. And then to throw it all in, make it, this whole marketable thing, and where you can, peddle your wares and what have you. Yeah, it's probably my favorite scene in these three chapters.
Yeah. And I mean, it's an illustration of, like, obviously this is an early thing to say, but if the rest of the book is as genius as the first 25 pages are, and especially including something like this, like there's no way I'm not going to come away from this thinking that it is my favorite Pynchon novel. But it's such an early thing that comes up that's just so well representative of the different stuff that Pynchon has been talking about for so long. And then, of course, the scene after it with Randolph at the detective agency, showcasing the counterforce and all of that. It's really, really, really impressive stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the midst of all of those scenes, what I really appreciate about them is the way that the totalization of culture is strewn throughout on the micro level, because you have the pygmies saying Christian hymns in the pygmy dialect, but a lot more subtly you have Chinese boxers fainted, kicked, and threw one another to and fro, when boxing does not include it does include fainting. It doesn't include kicking or throwing people. There's no grappling or kicking in boxing. It's clearly kung fu of some form practitioners, but the observers in our viewpoint is Americans, and so they're boxers. And on the flip side, kind of inverting that linguistic dynamic. You have the Tarahumara Indians. I'm just gonna ... a lot of that, pretending to eat vision-producing cacti that sent them into dramatic convulsions scarcely distinguishable from those of the common geek long familiar to American carnival goers. Where it's clearly couched as, look, it's a lot like, a geek show, which if you haven't, if any listeners don't know what a geek show was, genuinely warning for looking it up. It's a horrible, horrible
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But suffice to say, in that you have these people playing a mockery of their own culture, which obviously being may not obviously, but based on them being Northern Mexican, they would be eating like peyote, which does not like send you into convulsions. But the only thing that the observers can understand, kind of extreme demonstration, where the geek show, the convulsions are from trying to force yourself to swallow a live animal or something. And in this case, it's just them trying to demonstrate, like, well, we eat peyote and we have spiritual, or however they would have framed it, visions and experiences on that. But how do we sell that? Well, we pretend to eat it and then we flail around. It just takes all of the value out of it in a very direct and serious sense, in a way that is in the language.
Yep. Agreed. That one in particular about the convulsing, the consuming of hallucinogen, cat, that really, more than probably any other single, sold to me what Pinchon was doing here.
Not the Tungus reindeer show.
No, that just sounds charming.
Right? That's a wholesome good time.
Yeah, who doesn't
We've all
want to
seen
pet a
Clerks.
reindeer? So next up, they encounter somebody playing 3-card Monty. In case you're somehow unfamiliar with what that is, it's a hustler's card game where they show you a card and they say you just have to watch this particular card and tell me where it is at the end, and you win some money. But using sleight of hand, they take it off the table entirely. And Miles seems to suddenly get a bout of clairvoyance, where not only does he know that the card wasn't on the table, but he knows exactly what the practitioner of the 3-card Monty did with it. And the man gives him his money and then quickly packs up his table and runs away, because the last time this happened to him, he got arrested. And so then they have a brief sort of conversation back and forth about the fact that sometimes it feels as though he has electricity in his body that allows him to kind of see how everything connects and fits together like puzzle pieces. Again, I would imagine that this shows up later in the book. I would like to think that part of this is a reference to how good Miles Davis was at putting together bands and music composition. But I'm sure that that's just wishful thinking on my part. Do we have any additional thoughts on sort of Miles's clairvoyance and kind of what he is getting into here? The Pinchon Wiki talks about it in terms of epilepsy, but I don't think that makes really much sense.
No,
for,
it doesn't.
The book.
It doesn't. I could be dismissive of it, and kind of it's reminiscent of scenes in a movie where someone normally presented as a less intelligent person has a moment of brilliance, and then it just immediately it's I don't know, it's blacked out, and that all happened. I don't think that's the case here, but I don't want to get too far into it. Just there's a lot of foreshadowing in these early chapters.
Sure.
And
which then it reads like that on the page.
Yeah. He's not trying to hide the fact that this is important later.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's definitely, these things are going to come into play later for sure.
Gotcha.
Well, so I have a question for Cody and Luke. Just in terms of characterization, I don't disagree with you, Kate, earlier saying that Miles is portrayed as a kind of a fool in these opening scenes. But throughout the rest of the book, I don't think he not even in the this kind of sense of everything coming to him, but just I think he's not really a fool. He's just kind of looks and acts like one in that very surface level way.
I could you like it's an affectation almost.
No, not even. Just he's a klutz.
Or he's okay. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a part of his charm in a way. You know, he's not dumb. He's just a klutz. He's like a teenager who's too big for his body almost, and doesn't know how to like fully move yet, and
But-
and adapt to,
I mean,
to
that
size.
could be literally true as well, because
That
we don't
could-
know
yeah,
how
very
old they
well.
are.
Yeah.
It's not quite to the level of V in that hilarious scene where everything goes wrong for him while he's trying to just like shave and get ready for
Yeah.
his day, which is I think one of the funniest things I've ever read. Just that description of like the shower was cold, he tried fixing it, and the knob came off, but not before the water turned like boiling hot, and then he went to shave and he somehow like broke the entire sink, and then like yeah, it's just similar.
It's a Michael Richards scene. essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Miles is just a bit of a
He's a Kramer.
schlemiel.
One thing I wanted to point out is that the $10 note, like that would be, I tried
That's
to
a
Google
lot of
it,
money
and I
back
didn't
then.
find.
A lot of
Yeah,
money in 1893.
Yeah, I think it would be between $200 and $350 in today's money. I'm
Probably
not
right,
100% on that, but I think it'd be like it's a lot of money. Yeah.
Buy a
That's
car back.
probably it's probably before they started tracking inflation.
Yeah.
If you were trying to put it in one of those calculators.
Yeah, I mean, he clear. What I love about that scene is that Miles seems to understand what's going on in terms of the dynamic, and Lindsay clearly does not. Because
Yeah.
$10 that's bribe money. That is, you pay off a judge.
Yeah.
Not in the modern day, but back
Is
then.
it this guy's first time getting caught? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
like
he's
he
gotta pay
sees
up.
these guys, thinks they're easy marks because of their age, and then he's like, "Oh shoot, these guys are clever." And here, take all of my earnings.
So after this sort of aside about the electricity in his head, they go inside of the fair and talk about wanting to try Cracker Jack. The 1893 World's Fair was the first time that Cracker Jack, the candy, is it candy? I don't. It's not really candy.
It's
the
a
snack
confection,
food,
I guess.
the confection, I guess. Yeah. I'll be honest. I've never had it. I've been to
What?
baseball game. I've never had it. I've been to baseball
Really?
games. I've seen people eating it. I don't actually know what it is.
It's caramel popcorn with
Okay.
like honey roasted peanuts in it, basically.
Okay.
It's not bad. It's not like I haven't had Cracker Jack since I was a kid, and I wouldn't go out of my way to get it now. Like if I'm at a ball game, hot dog and nachos or something like that. But yeah, Cracker
Right.
Jack's not bad.
No, I mean it's like a mass-produced version of, there's the joke about tourists going to New York and getting enticed by the spiced nuts. It's
Okay.
it's like a mass-produced version of that.
Yeah. Yeah, so they're gonna go off and eat Cracker Jack. How fun! How what probably the most exciting day in their life in 1893.
Cracker Jack time.
Yeah, and then the shift in kind of narrative occurs because Randolph is headed into the city, not to see a woman, but instead to see somebody that he knows who works for White City Investigations, but not before being mildly harassed by a secretary. It's after bedtime, Sonny, which makes me wonder how old he is. Like, is he
They're
also
teenagers.
just as young as the rest of them?
Yeah.
See, I assumed he would be a little bit
I think-
older.
I think Randolph is maybe in his early 20s, but he's probably baby faced.
Okay, sure.
So
The door was open. Yeah, and maybe this ain't the Epworth League, which was like a Methodist boys league in America at that time. And then we get introduced to his friend Nate, who seems to run the investigations here coming out of White City, who has an interesting photo of himself and Doc Holliday pointing guns at each other in his office, which is just sort of an interesting thing to have. And there's a reference here to the Haymarket bomb. This is real history that's being referenced.
Yeah.
Cody, you have some good notes in here. Did you want to read there what you have?
I had a very surface level knowledge of this incident, but I did a little bit more research on it. So basically, what happened here? This was it's considered the climax of the unrest that was happening between the working class and the early corporate entities that were starting to come up, where you really started to have a lot of physical conflict between these two entities. So you'd have these workers that were striking for better hours, safer conditions, better benefits, and the corporations who obviously just didn't give a shit and didn't want that. And this was kind of the culmination of it. It was a big gathering. Someone, no one to this day knows who, threw a bomb, and it ended up killing a police officer. The trial that resulted as all of this kind of settled down and they started finding people was, it's been described as a mockery of justice in some senses. They essentially rounded up a total of 8 anarchists who were pretty well known at the time in the area and who could be placed at the scene at the time. What came out later was that they could really only definitively put, I think, 2 or 3 of them actually being there. And the evidence that they had at the trial was tenuous at best. They were trying to pin the maker of the bomb as one of the anarchists. Recently, from what I saw, they actually have kind of narrowed it down to the brother of one of the guys who was arrested, but they still can't say definitively who actually threw it. They went through hundreds of potential jurors and kept dismissing them because the bailiff and the judge essentially wanted to get people that they knew would convict these people because it was the only way they could get the trial to get pushed through. And they ended up convicting, I think, all 8 of the people that they had arrested.
They did. And
they eventually, I think it was the judge offered clemency to all of them if they would basically they could commute their death sentences and take a life sentence if they would just basically say, like, yeah, you put a guilty plea in. And only a couple of them, I think, actually took that. The rest of them were like, no, because then I'm implicating myself or I'm saying that I was there. I wasn't there. There was suspicion that the Pinkertons may have actually been involved in the bombing. A lot of the people who were associated with the anarchist group and the people who were arrested deny that and say that, no, this definitely was someone involved with the group. And definitely, and there's not really a whole lot of evidence to support the idea that the Pinkertons were behind it, but this was essentially the kind of the breaking point for all of this. And after this, you started really seeing, you know, the creation of the Pinkertons and the crackdown, the physical crackdowns on strikers and union busting that would start to come out of this. So I think it's very important this being mentioned this early in the book, because a lot of what happens going forward, especially with, you know, relation to unions and striking and the attempts for workers to get better conditions and better treatment and the struggles that they were up against, plays a major part in this book. And this was kind of the sort of final straw for all of that, and where it all really kind of exploded, for lack of a better term.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think it's also important too, from a perspective of, like, as Pynchon is analyzing the sort of levers of power, that the 350 people who gathered to protest for an 8-hour workday are just they're just workers.
Yeah,
like they were just people who didn't want to be worked to death. But instead of being rightly seen that way, simply because they are sort of resisting the expanding sort of modality of capitalism and commerce, they're viewed purely as anarchists.
Yeah.
And that is used as sort of a cudgel to wield against them when something like this does happen. Which, to your point, historically is what led to the expansion of stuff like the Pinkertons, which at one time had so many agents that, like, there was more of them than there were people in the army, which is crazy. The history of the Pinkertons is wild. And the fact that they still exist is it's just sad, I guess I'll say.
Well, we're very happy about it. We like the Pinkertons. We think they're a good force in the world.
Friends of the
Anarchists are evil.
podcast.
Friend of the pod, the Pinkerton Detective Agency.
Yeah. Welcome on the show anytime.
Yeah.
No, I learned today Dashiell Hammett was actually a Pinkerton investigator for a while.
Was he?
Yeah.
Was he one of the ones doing, like, actual work rather than just beating up, like, farm workers?
He apparently left pretty early on into it, but he used a lot of his experience there to form the basis of his Continental Op character in his early work.
Oh, okay.
But then obviously he shifted much more left in his later years and ended up on blacklists and whatnot. So,
right.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting. I didn't know that.
Huh, I didn't know that either. Really, between the Haymarket affair and the trial of the Chicago 7 after the DNC riot, Chicago doesn't have a great track record with show trials taking place in the city.
Yeah.
And this is where we get into kind of what I had sort of related to earlier, where like you take these organizations and you give them what seems sort of benign enough that they're not going to know that they're being sort of infiltrated or used for those levers of power. All this guy wants them to do is just take somebody up in their airship and look down, right? That's a very benign thing to ask them to do. But of course, what they are engaging in from a perspective of, you know, the levers of power that they're helping pull, or from the organizations that they're sort of aligning themselves with, that of course is a very different thing. Like, yes, bringing someone into your ship to just like look down at the city from above is not that crazy, but what is that guy doing? You know, there's just like what is that information going to be used for? How is that going to be sort of turned against them in the future? It sort of is like in Vineland, where they're talking about like, I'm like, you know, Frenesi needing to use somebody else just to get a gun in the hands of Weed Atman, right? Like she's not actually telling that person to kill him, but you know, just putting something there is an entirely different thing.
Yeah. And to tie it back to that too, if you look at what's actually happening, and going back to the thing with Porfirio Diaz and the chums being inserted into those kind of situations, we have to remember that they are teenagers. And this is very similar to like in Vineland, when the way they're pitching joining the army to, you know, 18-year-olds and whatnot, like, hey, come have a good time and, you know, do this and do this for your country and blah, 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 blah. These are naive kids who really don't know any better. And they think that they're doing this to, you know, serve some purpose for their country, or to, you know, gain some skill that they can't get anywhere else. But they're really essentially just being manipulated and used to, you know, carry out these operations because they don't know any better.
Yeah,
and
they're
get them that young.
patriots.
Yeah, you get them that young, and then you've got them forever, because that's going to be all they know at that point.
Yep.
So it's really, you know, there's a lot of joking and you know, skylarking that's going on with these kids, but at the same time, like, it's really disturbing what purpose they're being used for, and that they just can't see.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is once again where we get another reference to the national office as far as what their pay would look like. So we also know they're being paid for all the stuff that they're doing, where, you know, they won't be able to pay them as well as the Pinkertons might, but they believe that, you know, it'll be an attractive enough offer. Randolph understands that that this isn't up to him; it's between him and his friend in the national office. But then there's an interesting line here where it says, he was peering at Randolph now with that mixture of contempt and pity which the chums in their contact with the ground population were sooner or later sure to evoke, which is an interesting description of how people react to them. And I'm sure will continue to be sort of developed as time goes on. So again, it's just these little hints that like, something else going on here. This is maybe not that great of an organization. and then of course when he asks what it is that they need him to do, he says that they just need somebody to go on the ship and look around, out to the fair, maybe down at the yards, duck soup, which is not just a Marx Brothers reference, but also slang at the time for easy work, or, you know, nothing too difficult. And that is where we leave off. Is there anything else that anyone wants to say about chapter 3?
I wanted to highlight the dime turn, I guess, of the genre there, between the scene of Miles and Lindsay walking through the fairgrounds, and then segueing to Randolph. And really all that needs to be pointed at is Randolph tugged the brim of his hat a bit lower, looked swiftly up and down the littered and shadowy street, and sidled in the entrance. Like, that is the most noir thing you could possibly write.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, that is. He pulls his hat down, he looks back and forth, and he sneaks in a door. Well, if no one has anything else from chapter 3, that brings us to any funny parts. Was there anything that we missed as we covered the material?
Well, in terms of sheer comedy, we did leave out the fact that Lindsay was dangling Darby over the the rails, essentially.
Yeah.
Just
Good
with
night,
such ease, such practice.
I guess, too, another thing would be all of the different insertions of book titles.
The
Just-
Chums of Chance book names
Yeah.
are pretty damn good.
Chums of Chance on Krakatoa. Chums of Chance in the search for Atlantis.
The Chums of Chance and the Curse of the Great Kahuna.
I'm sure those were plenty of fun to write.
Oh, yeah, they had to have been.
So I suppose that brings us to quotes. Does anyone in particular want to go first?
I can.
Okay.
My quote, we've already kind of gone over it, but it's the quote from page 22. It's the paragraph that starts with armed bouncers drawn from the ranks of the Chicago police patrolled the shadows restlessly. Then it goes on from there. We already read most of it. I just love that quote. I mean, I generally love the description of the fair. I think I already talked about that a little bit, but that paragraph in particular is just really compact. The imagery is amazing. Like you can kind of, it creates like a kind of a kaleidoscopic, view of the fair where there's all this stuff going on and it's very busy and there's all this stuff to look at and it's obviously kind of awe-inspiring for the two chums of chance to look at. So
Mine is right after the opening paragraph of chapter 2 that you read earlier, Kate. Just that continuance of them going into the stockyards.
Mhm.
Beneath the rubbernecking Chums of Chance wheeled streets and alleyways in a Cartesian grid, sketched in sepia mile on mile. The great bovine city of the world, breathed Lindsay in wonder. Indeed, the backs of cattle far outnumber the tops of human hats. From this height, it was as if the chums, who out on adventures past had often witnessed the vast herds of cattle adrift in ever-changing cloud-like patterns across the western plains, here saw that unshaped freedom being rationalized into movement only in straight lines and at right angles and a progressive reduction of choices until the final turn through the final gate that led to the killing floor. I think that's just especially given that descent into the fair and that kind of idea of the restriction of freedom and if you kind of zoom that out on a macro and how we went from this a species, if you really want to go back far enough, that was just free roaming and exploring the land, and then now we've gotten to a point where everything is we're sort of rubbernecked into these things and put on rails as far as where we're going, and we can only turn one way or the other way, and it all just leads to this definitive end where there's no good outcome that we can really expect from it.
My quote was from the end of chapter 2, page 20. After that stuff that we'd read about the sieges of Paris, it continues on to say, nowadays, Penny said, they'll fly wherever they're needed. Far above fortress walls and national boundaries, running blockades, feeding the hungry, sheltering the sick and persecuted. So of course, they make any enemies at every place they go. They get fired at from the ground all the time. But this was different. We happened to be up with them that one day, and it was just the queerest thing. Nobody saw any projectiles, but there was a kind of force, energy we could feel directed personally at us. Somebody out there, Zip said solemnly. Empty space, but inhabited. I choose that one because that quote stuck in my craw, so to speak, for days. Because it deals with so many of these elements that we have talked about and that I have gained a better appreciation for as we have kind of explored Pynchon's work as a whole and as a sort of continuous storyline of literature that kind of maps out this alternate history, in that what these people are doing isn't a bad thing. They're rescuing people, they are feeding the sick and the hungry, and they're trying to take care of the downtrodden from these societal elements, right?
Mhm.
But at the same time, they are suddenly assailed by this force, right? And I think that could be one of many things. I think that could be talking about the idea that even if you're using modernity and modern technology and the trappings of a modern society to do good, like feeding the sick or helping, the refugees or things like that, flying over borders, you're still propagating that, and that kind of natural sort of response of the earth trying to vomit out these people who are hurting it is still going to come for you. Just because you're using that technology for good doesn't mean that you're not still propagating the same thing. But it also almost, in a way, and this could be conspiracy corner shit, but like it feels like almost like the birth of the counterforce in that moment to the positive aspect of what they're doing, and this idea of like we are doing something good, but and even though they can't use modern technology in the form of like guns or ground fire or whatever to take us out because we're in the air, in that moment there is still this sort of capital T they that was birthed in that they're going to bring us down somehow, but they just have to do that. And that like malevolence was so powerful that it sort of filled the air in a way. I don't know. There's something about it, like the different elements to that of the narratives of force and counterforce, of the changing sort of patterns of history, and of like even if you do make this advance where you're able to fly over the top of them, and you're able to do that to continue kind of the work of resistance, a new version of a counterforce against you is going to be born, and when that happens, you're going to feel it, and you're going to know that something is changing. It was a section that really struck me there in a way that is not typical for the stuff that I picked for the quotes that I do.
Yeah, and in the spirit of a earlier conversation about the mid 2000s vibe in the U.S., just with with that quote, think of they hate us for our freedom.
Yeah, good way to put it.
But I do think every single quote that has both been read on in the earlier part of the show and then selected by each of you was one of my considerations. So I'm glad we're all on the same page.
Yeah, we really knocked it out of the park on the first episode. Hell yeah.
Regardless, I do have a choice at hand. On page 14, right in the middle of chapter 2. I think we've settled on calling them chapters. Since that morning, before the first light, the gay, picnic-going throng of aeromaniacs of one sort and another had been continuing all day now to vol au voile in, till long after sundown, through the midwestern summer evening whose fading light they were most of them too busy quite to catch the melancholy of. Their wings both stationary and aflap, gull and albatross and bat-styled wings, wings of gold-beater's skin and bamboo, wings laboriously detailed with celluloid feathers, in a great heaven-wide twinkling they came, bearing all degrees of aviator from laboratory skeptic to Jesus-wrapped ascensionary, accompanied often by skydogs who had learned how to sit still, crowded next to them in the steering cabins of their small airships, observing the instrument panels and barking if they noticed something the pilot had failed to, though others could be observed at gunwales and flying bridges, their heads thrust out into the passing airflow, looks of bliss on their faces. From time to time the aeronauts hailed one another through megaphones, and the evening was thus a twitter, like the trees of many a street in the city nearby, with aviatory pleasantries. After all of the deep, dense thematic discussion we've had so far, and all of the dense thematicism of the quotes y'all chose, I just felt like maybe just a nice, beautiful scene would be a good way to end that
Yeah,
section.
good choice. That brings us to the most pinch on part of the chapter. Does anyone have one that sticks out to them?
I just think in general the stylistic skill that he's displaying here, I think this is for me at least, and say it's biased because it's my favorite of his books, but I think this is among, if not his best opening sections. Like beyond just like single line, I don't think you can get better than Screaming Comes Across the Sky. But in terms of table setting and doing a lot of world building and character introduction within a 25-page span, it's phenomenal. And for him doing this in a genre that he has not really written in before and keeping true to that genre without it being blocky and corny as a lot of those adventure books kind of are,
Yep.
and then shifting gears super smoothly into the detective noir kind of thing, it's brilliant.
Mm-hmm. I would actually say that the shift from the adventure writing to the noir, that sort of pivot point that Will talked about, would be the most pinch on part of the chapter to me. Because not only does it happen so flawlessly and so indicative of the genre to the way that Will kind of put it, it also doesn't feel jarring. Like it doesn't come across as, oh, I'm in like a different book now. It's still fits with sort of the way that you've been reading up until then. And that's incredibly hard to do.
Yeah.
to change your tone without sort of disorienting the reader. That is truly impressive to me. And also, just to piggyback off your point, Cody, can you imagine the sheer number of those schlocky books that Pynchon probably had to read
Oh,
for
yeah.
like
But you can
preparation to
fly
write this?
through those books. Those are
I know,
day reads.
but that doesn't
yeah,
that doesn't mean it's an enjoyable process.
no.
Especially
But-
when you're on number 38 or whatever.
of the same kind of copy paste adventure. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's definitely it's a you can't write this well without knowing that material well enough. Like you can't just read a Biggles book and a Hardy Boys and then write it on this level. It's just not. You have to really know what you're doing.
To kind of build off Cody's what Cody was just saying, I have two most mentioned parts. The first is a lot more serious than the second one, but the first one is just kind of the depth of knowledge that Pynchon displays in this opening section. The stuff about the Siege of Paris, that's a bit of a deeper cut in terms of its historical relevance and its how studied it is, how important it is today. The Haymarket riot, that's not common knowledge to people. I would say the Chicago Fair is probably a little bit more well known than those other two I just talked about, but even that is not necessarily super, super well known. But yeah, Pynchon obviously did his research for this book, and that is probably my main most mentioned part. Is just like a lot of authors, I don't think have the breadth of knowledge that Pynchon has in terms of history and technical stuff. With like y'all were talking about the mathematics and the Riemann hypothesis or whatever, the Riemann hypothesis. My second is a lot more, is kind of maybe one I could have included. And the funny part, Pynchon calling piss and shit falling from the sky an almost religious experience is something that only Pynchon would do, and it's just kind of funny. And I like that part a lot. I just thought it was kind of funny that he called it almost religious.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention in the bigger part of our conversation how much that was resonant to the cargo cults in post World War II in Polynesia. I really appreciate the kind of blurring there. But my most Pynchon part is basically the way that the Chums of Chance at this stage of the book, where you really know very little about their characters other than the surface level traits, how well they demonstrate the way that a chain of command can be used to alienate the decision makers and the people with stakes from the outcomes of their subordinates. Best scene, I think, in the way that Lindsay is berating Miles and Darby and insulting them in such clear language, and Randolph St. Cosmo just doesn't have the time or the patience to deal with the fact that Darby's pointing out that, yeah, sure, Darby uses slang, but is slang worse than actually insulting your crew members? Is that's not right. But Lindsay's there, and Lindsay has his responsibility, and his responsibility is to maintain order. And Randolph has his responsibility, and that is to make sure that everything doesn't explode, literally. And Darby is just, a little kid who just wants everyone to be nice and to gaze at the wonders of the world beneath him.
Yeah.
And it's just beautiful.
We didn't get any specific questions in the email, but Luke, you did get some stuff on Instagram you wanted to share?
We have our Scottish friend Kenny has sent some nice notes recently, which I've appreciated. So thank you, Kenny. But generally, people on Instagram have seen. I gotten a few different DMs and comments on posts about when we're going to start Against the Day. People generally have seemed excited about it, which I believe that I can speak for the other co-hosts, and in that we've all been looking forward to this for a long time. We were all pretty excited about it. So yeah, it's just been nice to see people sharing our enthusiasm for the work on Instagram.
Yeah, it's definitely. It's nice to know that people are looking forward to it as much as we have been, and and hopefully we can add to their experience.
Yeah, I can certainly second that. As the sort of start to recording has gotten closer, I've been more excited about reading it, and then finally, when I did start reading it, I was like, oh, I can already tell I'm really going to enjoy going through this book. We'll see if I still feel that way in 2 years, but
Right.
yeah, it's been very exciting, and the audience reaction we had towards the end of Bleeding Edge, and then over the course of our break has been really nice.
I think, didn't we have someone that asked when we were going to do a bonus episode on the Leanne Rimes book for real? I'll make it happen.
Yeah, that's true. You'll have to actually read that, Cody.
We'll have to track it down, and I will do the hard work of reading it, and I will do a brief bonus episode on it at some point, maybe just to kind of throw in between Against the Day parts. On that note, in between the sections of Against the Day, in between the sort of books as they're titled in there, we're going to do the short stories that are contained within Slow Learner. So once we finish up part 1 and we do the wrap up episode on that, we'll start tackling the first story. I don't remember which one is first in Slow Learner off the top of my head. And then we'll just kind of, as we end each section of Against the Day, we'll do another one of the short stories from Slow Learner to fill that time in between. And then that way we should finish Against the Day and then finish the last story in Slow Learner.
Yeah, we'll knock another one off the list while we're going through it. And then we'll be like well past halfway done with his bibliography.
And we'll only have one more big thick one.
That's true. Which is the shortest of the big thick ones.
Yeah.
Well, some people consider V, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's, what, 450? Maybe a little
Something
more?
like that.
Yeah.
500.
I suppose that would be Big Thick Junior.
Yeah.
But we're putting that one off.
Will hates it.
There was a real visceral level of disdain in what Will just said.
We're putting that one off.
I mean, look, the highlight of that book in my mind is a reference to a 100-page philosophical treatise. That's my opinion on V.
I don't know, the religious rats was pretty funny. There's some good parts in V.
No, I'm playing it up.
Yeah. Well, it's part of your character. You have to.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I must epitomize myself.
Yeah, at any rate, in the weirdest segue of all time, next week we're going to be discussing pages 26 through 56. And again, if you are someone who is reading the European paperback that has different pagination, the chapters that is going to be covering ends with the line, all moving in closer to the fires of fair debris, once the substance of wonder, as the temperature headed down. So, once you get to that line, stop, or don't. I'm not your parent. And that is the portion of the book that we'll be covering. As always, if you think our show is worth $1, we would love to have it. If you'd consider donating to our Ko-Fi project, we are on Ko-Fi at Mapping the Zone. Any funds we receive through that are going to be used to upgrade equipment or pay hosting fees, and just generally help make the quality of the show better for everybody. Once again, that is ko-fi.com/mappingthezone. And we are, as always, available on Instagram at Mapping the Zone Pod. You can check us out on Twitter at PinchonPod, or if you have any insightful comments or questions to ask, or if you want to record the ukulele song for us, you can send that to us, and we will play it before the show, just like we did the lovely listener submission related to the song in Bleeding Edge. And our email for anything like that, any miscellaneous debris, is mappingthezonepod@gmail.com. And as a reminder to the listeners, with Against the Day, we are switching our format from being a weekly release to a release every other week. So we will not see you next Sunday, but the Friday. That's when that show comes out. Not next Friday, but the Friday afterwards. And then every other Friday after that until we're done in January of 2026.
I can't believe you just leaked such important operational
I know. This show doesn't record on Sundays. We record this the day you guys did.
We put it live to tape.
Yes.
I have
literally
hours of magnetic tape in my office.
Yep.
storing every episode of this show.
Cody has damn near 2 years of magnetic tape worth of.
It's all on a reel to reel that takes up an entire wall.
Yeah. We're very impressed that he's able to cut all of that tape and then upload it to his computer and then publish it to the RSS feed.
Yeah, it's a real. I have to convert it off analog to digital just to upload it. But it's worth it, damn it, because it sounds so good.
It's
I thought we
later.
were still on the what we started with, where it was read live every time someone downloaded the show. Glad you figured out how to transition that.
Yeah.
That seemed really baroque.
What do you
Not
think the
expensive to pay all
Ko-Fi
those
funds
people.
have been used for? Used to buy
Good
all that
use,
recording
apparently.
equipment. Oh boy. Anyway, I think we've recorded long enough. So
I'm running out of tape. The tape's running out. Let's go.
tape's running out. So we will see you guys in 2 weeks as we cover the next section of pages. And until next time, thanks for listening.
Bye.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.